steel, firearms, and the industrialists crossing into another world. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 676 Inducement. Callum sat astride his horse, his brow furrowed. Before him lay dozens of orc corpses scattered haphazardly on the ground. It was a gruesome scene, the air still reeked of blood, and swarms of flies, seemingly appearing from nowhere, gathered on the bodies, feasting on them. The dead orc soldiers gripped their weapons tightly. These once strong and agile warriors now lay on the cold ground. Many were mangled and bloodied, their twisted faces still revealing pain and rage. Those whose eyes were still open showed the hatred and resentment of their dying moments. It looks like they were ambushed in a terrible way. Ferrandro and Boyle, who had accompanied Callum, were frightened by the orc general's silence and could only exchange their observations in hushed tones. Collect their bodies, Callum issued his first order of the day. Yes, sir. His men dismounted and began to carry and move the corpses, arranging them neatly on a flat patch of grass. The Urg squad numbered 30 men, not a single one surrendered, they were all killed in action. The orc responsible for examining the bodies reported to Callum. What was the enemy's situation? Judging from the footprints, their numbers were between 50 and 60, undoubtedly humans. From the battlefield traces, Urg and his men were first tripped by a tripwire. Then a barrage of crossbow bolts came from the side of the road, causing considerable casualties. Finally, the humans suddenly rushed out of the forest to attack them. Everyone fought to their last breath, they are heroes. After patiently listening to his subordinate's report, Callum walked to the bodies. He silently murmured, "Rest in peace, warriors of the grasslands, may you soon be embraced by the spirits of the grasslands." His men lit a fire, burning the bodies to ashes. Life on the grasslands was harsh. Orc funerals were not as elaborate as in the human world, often just a simple cremation. They have proven their courage, so what should we do? Callum's eyes widened like two copper bells as he loudly questioned his accompanying men, the firelight staining his entire face red. The orcs, spurred on by their general's imposing presence, raised their arms and shouted. Avenge them, kill the humans, large them, annihilate them. Hearing those howls, Ferrandro and Boyle frowned. Was it really the right choice for the Grand Duke to send such a bunch of people into the human world? However, they were already here. Since they were ambushed here, the royal army must be heading towards Blackrock Plains along this road, which is why they left troops behind to cover their retreat, Boyle stated his assessment. A cruel glint flashed in Callum's eyes as he clenched his right fist so tightly that his knuckles cracked. I will catch up with them along this road. I will use their blood to atone for my people. Wah! The orc general threw his head back and let out a deafening roar. As the whistling sound spread rapidly, the earth trembled as if a switch had been flipped. A rumbling sound, like waves, swept in from afar. Ferrandro turned to look, and soon, countless cavalrymen appeared in his field of vision, tall and robust, their mounts equally tall and strong. Each of them had a resolute expression and a cold face, as if a single command from their superior could unleash one of the most destructive forces in the world. The wave of orc cavalry quickly swept through the forest. The dense hooves even compacting the grass on both sides of the road. Along this forest path, the massive wave continued westward, Sunset Valley, where the retreating royal army was temporarily encamped. A hurried figure approached the tent. I am Duke Osman Alambru, I wish to see Her Highness Catherine, please come in, Your Grace, Her Highness has been waiting for you. A guard considerately lifted the curtain at the tent entrance. Duke Alambru entered the tent and saw a figure studying a hanging map. Your Highness, Duke, it's been a long time. Catherine turned around, looking at the elderly nobleman before her, whose hair was already streaked with gray but whose mustache was still meticulously trimmed, and couldn't help but feel a pang of emotion. The Alambru family was the largest noble family in Blackrock Plains. The Duke was excited. Yes, the last time I saw you was in Crystal Radiance. Catherine's tone changed, but now is not the time for sentimentality. Are they the orcs you mentioned in your letter? Yes, the Duke cursed. Damn the Bradley family. I've long suspected they were problematic, so shameless as to cooperate with the orcs. Your Highness, How many orcs are coming to Blackrock Plains in total? Catherine smiled bitterly. Judging from all the signs, at least 15,000 are chasing us, and the Bradley family's army is cooperating with them. Hearing this, the Duke tensed up. Catherine reassured him, I've already sent Lester to create the illusion that we're retreating from another route. If successful, it can delay them for a few days. At this point, a hint of worry crept into Catherine's heart. He and his men were still not back. Duke Alambru, we need a victory to curb the orcs' arrogance. How many men can you mobilize, Your Highness? I can muster 20,000 from my own territory. As for the others, it depends on the situation. At least 20,000? Catherine was already quite satisfied, although she knew a large proportion of them were farmers with pitchforks. The Duke continued, I've already sent out notices. Soon, lords from all over Blackrock Plains will lead their troops to support us. Then we can form a large army and deliver a crushing blow to the orcs. Just as Catherine was about to say something, the tent flap was lifted, and Offina entered. Lester's back, that's wonderful. Catherine's heart finally settled. And another piece of good news? Offina smiled and handed over a piece of paper. A telegram. Catherine immediately took it, her heart pounding. The contents were brief, easily read at a glance. Paul will send an army to support us, the princess exclaimed with delight. Paul? Is that Earl Gleman? Duke Alambru immediately guessed who Catherine was referring to. He had met the Lord of Laketown in the capital, and the Duke had been present when the king announced the marriage. Chapter 677 The Beastman Messenger. Paul's letter arrived, and Catherine was delighted, but quickly regained her composure. Arda was a long way off, and launching an expedition from there would require a considerable amount of preparation. Paul's help was not an option for the time being. Catherine had to make the most of all available resources. Your Highness, Sir Montrute requests an audience, a guard announced as he entered. Montrute? Catherine searched her memory. I don't recognize the name. She shook her head in frustration, glancing at Offina, but received only a helpless shrug. It was Duke Alambru who reminded her. Your Highness, he is the heir to the Tavares family. The Tavares family? I know that family. Please let him in. The guard left, and a young man entered shortly after. He was tall, handsome, and had long, dark golden curly hair. Your Highness, Montrute knelt on one knee to greet the princess, then bowed to the Duke beside him. Duke Alambru asked, Montrute, how many men have you brought? The young man raised his head. I have brought 100 knights, each with superb martial skills and exceptional abilities, along with 1,000 robust soldiers. The Tavares family will defend the kingdom's honor to the death with all their might. His expression was resolute and fearless, seemingly genuine. Catherine was moved by his statement and nodded approvingly. This caused him to unconsciously raise his eyebrows. Offina said, based on previous estimates, including the Bradley family's army, the total number of enemies entering Blackrock Plains should be between 25,000 and 30,000. If we can gather an army of 20,000 before they arrive, we will have a fighting chance. Report. Lord Lester is back. A joyful shout came from outside. Everyone inside the tent perked up. Lester was quickly summoned in. Your Highness, the Orcish army has been tricked. They are pursuing us along a long route, and if nothing unexpected happens, they are still 6 or 7 days away. Is that so? Hearing Lester's words, everyone, including Catherine, breathed a sigh of relief. Having established a relatively safe distance from the Orcish army, the kingdom's army set up camp, awaiting reinforcements from various regions. Over the next few days, local lords received and obeyed the royal summons, gathering knights and recruiting soldiers in their territories, leading their troops to Sunset Valley to join the royal army. By the 4th day, Catherine's army had reached nearly 40,000 men. The army brought from the capital numbered around 5,000, and the arrival of these reinforcements greatly increased the army's fighting strength. The princess reorganized these troops from different territories to avoid command confusion. It was on the evening of the 4th day that scouts returned with the news of the Orcish army's approach. So fast? Catherine asked the scout incredulously. Each person in the Orcish army has 3 to 4 horses, and they take turns riding them while marching, so they are very fast, the scout reported his observations with a look of horror. The villages and towns along the way have all suffered. After the orcs entered towns and villages without defenses, they plundered supplies from the locals as much as possible, and forcibly conscripted able-bodied men into their auxiliary armies as laborers or cannon fodder. These orcs dare to be so brutal, they deserve to die. The scout's description infuriated Montlet Tavares. who slammed his fist on the table. Although the human armies of this era were no better than the pot calling the kettle black. Montlet looked at Catherine, his eyes filled with pleading. Your Highness, since they've come, let's fight them to the death. Anyone could see his desire to show off. I second that too. Yes, Your Highness, we are no longer afraid of the orcs in terms of numbers. Those present were all lords from across the Black Rock Plains. Once Montlet started, the others couldn't contain themselves any longer. How could they let this young man steal the limelight before the princess? Seeing the vassals' eagerness for battle, a certain string in Catherine's heart was plucked. If that's the case, then let's fight. Surprisingly, early the next morning, the orcs sent an envoy, a man with slicked back hair and a rather slender build compared to his kind. After being invited into the tent, he bowed to Catherine according to Alder court etiquette. Princess Catherine, beautiful lady, the grassland warrior Callum has sent me to discuss some matters with you. Catherine sat upright in the main seat, her tone cool as she inquired, Sir, how shall I address you? The orc replied with a smile, Your Highness, my name is Dieter Evans, and people call me Honest Evans. Catherine was curious, that sounds like a human name. Yes, Your Highness, Evans replied, I used to be a merchant, and my business was quite good. I frequently traveled between the Alder and the grasslands, so I speak fluent Alder and took this name. Then, Sir, what do you wish to discuss with me? The second son of the Bradley family, Sir Limist, Lord Callan wishes to have me take him back. Take him back, Catherine scoffed. Wishful thinking. I don't want to let any traitor escape. We can ransom him. You can name your price. Absolutely not. After a brief struggle, Evans seemed to accept reality and stopped trying to persuade Catherine to release Limus. All right, the task is complete. Thank you for listening, Your Highness. Catherine. Complete. Catherine was bewildered. What had this guy accomplished? She hadn't even released Limus. In fact, what I said just now was merely to give the Bradley family an explanation, Evans said frankly. However, everyone understood, the orc commander named Callum was just putting on an act. Let's move on to the next topic, Your Highness. Evans' playful expression vanished, replaced by a serious one. We hope Your Highness will surrender. Surrender? Catherine seemed to find it amusing. Go back and tell your master that in the history of the Alder Kingdom, there has never been a princess who surrendered to the enemy. Oh, won't you consider it carefully? Catherine was furious. It seems you're already certain you can defeat us. Yes, the orc envoy's answer nearly exploded the tent. Thank you to Yao Ang, and thank you to everyone who has supported this book. Chapter 678, Submitting the Declaration of War. Outrageous, how dare he say such a thing? Inside the tent, the generals and lords present were filled with righteous indignation, all rebuking Dieter Evans. Such an impudent fellow. Montlet rose, his hand on his sword, his eyes seemingly spitting fire. He looked at Catherine. We should cut off this arrogant fellow's head and let his followers take it back to show their steppe warriors. Catherine shook her head and gestured for him to sit down. Envoy, you have entered Alder lands without our king's permission, and you have colluded with our traitors to seize Watcher's fortress, killing our generals and soldiers. There is so much hatred between us, so please refrain from making unrealistic statements. Under the stern gaze of those deep blue eyes, the orc envoy bowed slightly. Oh, that's truly regrettable, Your Highness. Evans's expression shifted, no longer displaying the previous flippancy and provocation, but instead a solemn, almost reverent, reverence. I know that many of you have grown up in the civilized world and view us as uncivilized savages, harboring a deep sense of superiority over orcs. I must clarify, I am not being sarcastic, but genuinely agree with some of your views. Yes, in the past, orcs were indeed far behind the humans of the south, even our great chieftain Abar knew this. But, his tone took a sharp turn. Since great chieftain Abar established a new royal council, the situation has been completely different. I can now proudly say that orcs are no longer the uncivilized savages you once perceived them to be. We have our own national system, our own civilization, and from now on, we will engage in exchanges with human nations on an equal footing. TCH, Dempsey let out a disdainful sneer. So, the orcs' so-called communication is simply invading other countries' lands and slaughtering their people. The sarcasm was undeniably biting, but Dempsey was immediately met with a rebuttal. Don't try to portray yourself as so innocent, sir. Evans raised his head and said, for a very long time, so long ago, even before the establishment of the Alder Kingdom, weren't the human armies stationed at Watcher's fortress doing the same thing all along? Humans swept across the plains like sandstorms, instigating infighting between tribes, driving out orcs who were grazing their livestock, and even setting fire to entire swathes of grassland, causing our livestock to starve to death in large numbers, and the orcs who lost their livestock also starved to death. Fortunately, the grassland environment is unsuitable for farming, leaving the orcs a place to live, otherwise, my people would have long since turned to dust. Nonsense, the younger generals were furious, such as Montlet. How can you slander the warriors of Alder like this? We have never done anything so unjust. Oh, Evans narrowed his eyes, his gaze sweeping over the elderly people in the tent before finally settling on Duke Alambru. My lord, surely your life experience can attest that I am not lying. Duke Alambru hadn't expected the orc to ask him such a question. Ahem, he cleared his throat awkwardly. Even in the human world, there are many sordid disputes between neighboring countries. Who can truly distinguish between past grievances? The Duke evaded the question. Evans chuckled coldly. It was the decline of the kingdom that forced you to stop this behavior. It wasn't that you were unwilling, but that you couldn't. He reached into his robes and pulled out a roll of parchment. This is a challenge from Chief Abar to the Kingdom of Alder. It was originally intended for the Crystal Palace, but since we've encountered Princess Catherine here, I think there's no need to travel such a long distance. The attendant approached Evans, took the parchment scroll with both hands, and presented it to Catherine on the table before her. Catherine unfolded it and read it carefully, her brow furrowing deeper. She looked up at Evans. Please inform Chief Abar that the Kingdom of Alder accepts his challenge. In that case, I'll take my leave. Evans bowed to her and turned to leave the tent. 2 days later, the Orcish army finally arrived near Sunset Valley at dusk and set up camp not far from the kingdom's army. That night, Catherine rode out to inspect her camp and held a final discussion with everyone about the impending battle. Around 4 o'clock the next morning, before sunrise, the entire camp was bustling with activity. Everyone rose early, knights, with the help of their squires, donned their armor and checked their weapons, while soldiers began cooking to replenish their energy. Time ticked by, and the kingdom's army began to array itself. By sunrise, the army was fully deployed. The army was divided into 4 parts. In the center was a large infantry square of knights and soldiers, numbering approximately 20,000. On the left flank was a cavalry column of approximately 10,000 men, composed of knights from various territories of Blackrock Plains, their squires, and ordinary cavalry, and on the right flank was a cavalry column of approximately 7,000 men from the Royal Knights. Additionally, 3,000 archers were positioned in 3 rows at the front. They would engage the enemy with their bows when they charged, but would quickly retreat to the rear once the enemy approached. Whoosh, urged on by the horns, the kingdom's army began its advance. Not far off, the previously orderly ranks of the army began to crumble, gradually losing all semblance of their initial formation. Then, in the distance, rows of figures approached against the sun. It was the orc army. Many began to tense up. Just moments before, they had been tilling the land with hoes, and now they were to fight orcs with swords and spears? The officers tried to reassure them, assuring them that the orcs weren't as terrifying as they imagined. A single spear thrust through their hearts would be enough to kill them. With Princess Catherine's command, the advancing kingdom army came to an abrupt halt. The orc army stopped about 200 meters away. Catherine raised the binoculars Paul had given her, carefully observing the orc army. A large number of cavalry, that was Catherine's first impression upon seeing them. The orc cavalry consisted of both heavy and light cavalry. The heavy cavalry, like human knights, were fully armored, even their mounts were armored. Chapter 679 Engagement. When they were about several hundred meters apart, both sides stopped simultaneously. Everyone needed to regroup. Not only was the human army in disarray, but the orc army was too. The air was filled with shouts and the crack of whips from officers of all ranks, a chaotic mess. Nearly an hour later, the humans and orcs finally took their positions and faced each other. At this point, Catherine and the others could clearly see the orc army's formation. They had used light cavalry as the first line, divided into 3 formations, left, center, and right. The orc light cavalry mostly wore thin leather armor or no armor at all, and their weapons were long swords or swords, but each carried a short bow. Behind the 3 formations were catapults and ballistae, and further back were armored cavalry, presumably as reserves. The orc formation roughly formed a T-shape. Many people, such as Catherine and Duke Osman Alambru, had experienced training at Watcher's Fortress. They didn't underestimate the orcs' light cavalry-dominated formation, but rather observed it cautiously. These fearsome riders, swift as the wind, were incredibly agile in battle, ready to transform into sharp blades at any moment. The older generals, seeing the orc army for the first time, were somewhat disdainful of the light cavalry. In their eyes, these light cavalry were merely horsemen. How could they possibly contend with older knights wielding lances and clad in armor? The difference between them was like an egg against a rock. If they clashed, the egg would shatter into pieces. The heavy cavalry in the rear posed a slight threat, but judging from the orcs' deployment, their commanders didn't intend to use them as the main fighting force. Based on past experience, once the scales of victory began to tip in one direction, they would continue to tip. Could deploying heavy cavalry then salvage the situation? At this moment, the orcs, having completed their formation, began shouting insults, spewing out broken older profanities. The orcs' voices were loud, and their various vulgar and offensive slang terms carried clearly to the older army. The knights and officers of all ranks managed to endure it, but the lower-ranking soldiers were terrified and retaliated with equally profanities. For a moment, the area between the two armies was filled with a cacophony of profanities and insults. The catapults and ballistae, among other ranged units, began to fire, but their numbers and accuracy only allowed them to inflict sporadic casualties. Both armies endured the abuse. "Your Highness," the rapid sound of hooves rang out, and Montrich de Varus rode up to Catherine. The knight's attire was dazzling. He wore exquisitely crafted, fully gilded silver-white plate armor, adorned with intricate patterns that were mesmerizing. The armor fit him perfectly, clearly custom-made to his physique, making the young master appear even more imposing and distinguished. The knight bowed to Catherine from his horse. "Please allow me to lead the army in an attack first. Let the infantry lure the orc cavalry to attack and hold them back, then the cavalry on both flanks will strike together, clamping them down like pincers." At the recommendation of the local lords of Blackrock Plains, Montrich was assigned to command the central infantry. A heavy crossbow bolt that had just grazed him and embedded itself in the grass behind him had spurred him on, hence his suggestion. However, Catherine shook her head and refused. "Their light cavalry is far more mobile than ours, our infantry cannot hold them off. We shouldn't launch an attack, instead, we should wait and see, looking for an opportunity to defeat them while on the defensive, Your Highness." "I cannot agree," Montrich said anxiously. "All the military texts I've studied since childhood emphasize seizing the initiative in battle. How can you relinquish the chance to make the first move to someone else? Especially since we outnumber them." The generals around the princess were slightly annoyed. Duke Alambra rebuked, "Montlet, obey orders. You have no idea how terrifying those steppe riders are. Let me tell you, they practically grew up on horseback, master and mount are as inseparable as if they were born together." "Yes, Your Highness," and Your Highness, Montlet, looking dejected, spurred her horse back to the infantry formation to continue her command duties. In the opposing orc army, Commander Callum frowned slightly, stroking his chin. "It seems Princess Catherine has quite the composure." He waved his hand, summoning a messenger, led her men attack. A deep, resonant conch shell echoed across the battlefield. "Giddy up!" The orc cavalry in the center of the army spurred their mounts, the horses rearing up, carrying their riders as they charged towards the human army. "They're here." The orc army, from top to bottom, saw the enemy's movement and the dust rising in their wake. The sight of the massive cavalry charge was spectacular, the dust even obscuring the sky above them. Montlet stared intently ahead, unconsciously swallowing hard. On the Orcish side, with a whooshing sound, the archers at the front knocked their arrows, pointing them diagonally towards the sky. "Fire!" the commander roared, and countless arrows shot into the sky, whistling through the air. After a parabolic trajectory, the arrows transformed into a deadly rain of arrows, cascading over the heads of the charging orc cavalry. Sharp arrowheads pierced flesh, knocking orc riders off their horses. But this did not slow their advance. The cavalry continued to surge forward like a flood. After 4 volleys, the archers were forced to retreat into infantry positions for cover. At Montlet's command, the infantrymen wielding lances immediately braced their butts against the ground, their sharp tips pointing diagonally forward. The infantry phalanx instantly resembled a hedgehog. However, after reaching a certain distance, the orc cavalry halted their charge, turned their horses, and simultaneously drew their shortbows, knocking arrows and firing at the older infantry. The orcs' archery was highly accurate, even on horseback, especially given their densely packed formation. Arrows pierced through the gaps in the spears, and screams of pain echoed as men were struck. Protected by the infantry in the center, the older archers were ordered to retaliate, and the air crackled with the whistling of arrows. The Orc light cavalry surged onto the beach like waves, then retreated just as quickly, only to surge back again in a relentless cycle. Chapter 680 Attack. Wave after wave of harassment ignited the anger of the Alder army. Although the archers within the Alder ranks fought back desperately, their targets were moving targets, the galloping Orc cavalry, while the Alder troops in their formation were stationary targets for the Orcs. Shooting arrows from horseback was effortless for these races who had grown up on horseback. What's going on? Are we just going to stand here and take the beating? Complaints rose from the various Alder formations. Many couldn't understand why they weren't allowed to attack. Your Highness, Montlet again pleaded with Catherine, if this continues, our morale will soon collapse. Hearing his anxious tone, Catherine looked at her own ranks. Sure enough, the infantry square in the center and the knight square on the left flank were already restless. A dilemma arose in her mind. The armies of the Black Rock Plains lords ultimately lacked patience. She had carefully chosen this battlefield to counter the Orc cavalry's mobility advantage. Sunset Valley, as its name suggests, is a place sandwiched between two mountains. Although it is still relatively wide for a valley, it is sufficient to limit the large-scale movement of cavalry in both directions. Several hours before the main force of the army departed from the camp, a cavalry force of more than 2,000 men, under the command of Klein and Lester, quietly left the camp. Their objective was to sneak around to the rear of the Orcs via the mountain roads and launch an attack from behind while the main forces of the two armies were locked in a stalemate. However, in order to avoid detection by Orc scouts, they took a longer route, which is why Catherine insisted on holding back. According to the original plan, they would wait until the agreed moment to launch a simultaneous attack. This was a plan insisted upon by the generals who were familiar with Orc army tactics, and it was somewhat risky. Of course, if the Orcs abandoned their usual tactics and no longer used this kind of harassment, but instead charged directly in large groups, that would be even better for the Alder army. The Alder army would crush the Orcish advance with its superior numbers and armor, while the flanking force's mission would automatically become intercepting and killing the fleeing Orcs. Montlet, one of the senior commanders of this campaign, was aware of this deployment. However, he held another view. Even without the flanking force, the Alder army, with its main force facing the Orcs head-on, could still rout the Orcish army. The Orcs' harassment tactics gave him a reason to urge Catherine to attack as soon as possible. Catherine checked the time again. There was still an hour until the agreed-upon attack time. Perhaps Klein and his men had already arrived at their designated positions? After all, redundancy had been considered in the planning. Should they attack now? Or wait? Catherine, as the supreme commander, struggled to decide. Suddenly, a commotion erupted on the left flank, with countless shouts of celebration. Catherine looked in that direction and saw a knight suddenly leap out of formation, brandishing his lance and killing an Orc cavalryman who had gotten too close. The knight's actions weren't considered a violation of orders, as he hadn't strayed too far from the ranks and returned quickly after killing his target. No one would let a foolish enemy charge into their death escape. However, his unexpected move boosted morale but also fueled restlessness. Catherine realized that if the soldiers weren't given something to do, many might lose their minds. Attack, she finally commanded. When Catherine's order was relayed through the banners, the Alder army erupted in a tremendous cheer. The morale, shattered by repeated Orcish harassment, was instantly restored. Everyone was enthusiastic and eager for battle. The army quickly sprang into action. As planned, the left, center, and right phalanxes advanced simultaneously towards the Orcs. The center infantry, having gathered their strength, brandished their lances and charged towards the Orc cavalry who had turned back. The cavalry on the left and right flanks closely protected their sides to avoid being outflanked. The progress seemed to be going smoothly. Many Orc cavalrymen, caught off guard by the sudden attack, were caught off guard and killed along with their horses by the dense forest of spears. The enemy had finally suffered considerable casualties, a feat that further boosted the morale of the entire army. Kill, Montelli, in charge of commanding the central infantry, was extremely excited. He brandished his greatsword, directing his troops and urging them to continue their advance. He couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. If they defeated the Orcs, he would be credited with the greatest achievement in this battle, becoming a shining new military star in the kingdom. Imagine, With the Watcher's fortress fallen and the kingdom's northeastern territory lost, cutting off the Orc army's westward advance, what a tremendous honor. The infantry advanced even faster under his urging. On the Orc army's command post, Callum watched the battlefield unfold with wide eyes. The human army has finally struck, he coldly addressed the surrounding generals. The warriors of the plains will defeat them, slaughter them. But that army from Crystal Radiance is a threat. A fierce-looking orc with an eye patch shook his reins. Lord Callum, I request permission to lead the army to hold them off. Callum looked at him approvingly. Commendable courage, one-eyed wardler, but be prepared for a one-way trip. Ordinary human soldiers may be weak compared to us, but those are all skilled and powerful knights, no less formidable than the great chieftain Ziglafither warriors. A glint of light flashed in Wardler's remaining eye. That's exactly what I crave, great General Callum. Wardler and his warriors need worthy enemies to prove themselves. Callum nodded solemnly. Bring me my sword. His servant immediately handed him one. This is a longsword I purchased from a human merchant at a high price. While it may not be a divine weapon, it's crafted entirely from fine steel and is a rare find. I'm presenting it to you now. A flicker of excitement crossed Wardler's previously stern face as he solemnly accepted the sword clang. He eagerly drew the blade, its gleaming reflection dazzling him. He couldn't help but exclaim, a fine sword. The blade was engraved with intricate patterns. If someone knowledgeable were present, they would recognize it as a newly created Alder script. Northwest Industrial Manufacturing, serial number 1995-231. The font style of these letters was rather abstract, recognizable only to those with expertise, serving a certain degree of anti-counterfeiting. However, Callum believed these were simply decorative patterns used to adorn the blade. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 681 Defeat 1. In the vast valley, the three Alder armies advanced step by step, their momentum unstoppable. The Orc light cavalry continued their previous strategy: contact, disengagement, contact again, disengagement again. Thanks to their superior horsemanship, they quickly adapted to the Alder army's pace. The Orcs employed a divide-and-conquer strategy, deliberately luring the three armies further apart. The Alder army on the battlefield was a hastily assembled coalition of various factions, their coordination far from tight. The Orc strategy quickly took effect, and the distance between the three armies grew ever wider. Generals like Catherine were not unaware of the Orcs' intentions. On the surface, the battlefield appeared to be the Alder forcing the Orc cavalry to retreat, but in reality, the Orcs were leading the Alder by the nose. The waving of command flags never ceased, an effort to prevent their forces from becoming too scattered, but the effect was rather limited. Montlet, commanding the central infantry, grew increasingly anxious. Unlike Catherine and the others, he wasn't anxious about being led by the nose by his own Orcs. Montlet still believed his spearmen could slaughter the unarmored barbarians. His concern was that his allies, who had outflanked the Orcs, would soon launch an attack. Perhaps they were already on their way. At that point, the Orcish army would be able to launch a pincer attack on the Orcish forces. However, he wanted to gain more credit in this battle. His troops should be the main force in annihilating the Orcs. After much internal struggle, he gave the order: increase the advance speed, make contact with the enemy as soon as possible, and kill them. The infantry under his command immediately surged with morale, erupting in thunderous cheers. From officers to soldiers, they began to run forward, their fighting spirit soaring as they chased after the enemy ahead. Seeing their allies advance so fiercely, the knights on the left flank were not to be outdone, charging into battle against the approaching Orc cavalry. Thus, apart from the royal army on the right flank, the other two formations, cobbled together from local troops, were also crumbling. With a continued advance, they could no longer maintain their initial orderly ranks, instead becoming a chaotic scene like a bustling market. Catherine frowned, but she was helpless. These local lords' troops usually stayed in their own territories, only gathering in small groups during hunts to practice their coordination. And even that was a training opportunity only for knights and their squires. As for the hastily conscripted peasant soldiers, getting them to line up neatly was already a struggle, let alone maintain formation during an advance. It was practically impossible. Catherine could only order her personal troops to be on high alert, so they could provide immediate assistance should anything happen. The Orc commander, General Callum, looked on with satisfaction at the masterpiece of his army. "Begin the hunt," the command flag beside him fluttered loudly, conveying the general's will. The Orc light cavalry, who had been keeping a distance from the Orc infantry formation, suddenly began a rapid retreat. "The Orcs are avoiding our advance. They've lost, we've won." Everyone was excited at the sight of the enemy's retreat. The scattered movements of the Orcs' retreat evoked images of a rout. Soldiers, spears in hand, strode desperately after the enemy. "The Orcs are retreating," Catherine wondered. Feigning defeat is a skill that severely tests the overall quality of an army. One wrong move and it becomes a real defeat. Most battlefield commanders dare not use this tactic lightly. "Continue to cover the infantry's advance," Catherine ordered. "Your Highness, an army is attacking from the right." A cry of alarm drew Catherine's attention elsewhere. The princess quickly raised her binoculars and looked to the right. A cloud of dust filled the frame of the mirror as a tightly packed cavalry force charged toward them. This wasn't a harassment, it was clearly a battle for supremacy, a conclusion easily drawn from their posture. "Charge," Catherine commanded. Forgetting about protecting the infantry, the Royal Knights immediately adjusted their formation, preparing to meet the onrushing Orc cavalry. "Send word to Landru and Montlet to halt their advance." Catherine didn't forget to notify the other two formations. The Orc cavalry attacking from the flank was like an iron hammer, wielded with deadly force by an invisible hand. The well-trained Royal Knights showed no fear, they quickly formed a rectangular square. Catherine nodded to the bugler beside her, and a resounding bugle call immediately rang out. At the bugle's command, the knights spurred their mounts, and their horses began to trot at a slow pace. The bugle call quickened its pace, and the war horses followed suit, their pace accelerating from a trot to a full gallop, soon to meet the Orc cavalry. Catherine raised her hand, and the bugle's rhythm suddenly intensified. The knights, still maintaining their formation, also sped up, their horses almost off the ground, charging at breakneck speed. This continued for only a few breaths before the two sides clashed violently. A series of excruciating thuds echoed from the point of impact. Spears snapped, armor shattered, screams of the wounded filled the air. Countless such things occurred in an instant. "Holy crap," an Orc, clearly much stronger than his companions, threw his head back to the sky, letting out a deafening roar, his remaining eye gleaming with a cruel green light. He gripped a chainmail and a steel sword in his left hand, charging into the ranks and hacking and slashing indiscriminately. Those who encountered him were either killed or wounded. The Orc soldiers following behind him, as if injected with adrenaline, fought with fierce determination. "Stop them," Klein shouted, raising his lance and charging towards the terrifying Orc. "Die!" The Orc's blade struck Klein's lance, the recoil sending a sharp pain through him. Clang, his lance blocked, Klein gave up, drawing his longsword and rejoining the battle. The two cavalry units clashed fiercely, inflicting heavy casualties on both sides. At this point, the three sections of the Austrian army formed the 3 points of an equilateral triangle, with the infantry in the center at the apex, the three sections widely spaced. Forward! Forward! Montlet, commanding the advance, was so excited that he failed to notice the Royal Knights, covering his right flank, were already engaged in a fierce battle. Rumble. The earth began to tremble slightly, as if a giant beast was running ahead. Chapter 682 Defeat 2. When Montlet saw the billowing dust ahead and felt the increasingly intense tremors beneath his feet, he was initially stunned. What was happening? Had the Orcs launched a counterattack? Heavily armored Orc heavy cavalry, wielding long spears, emerged from the dust and charged towards the Alder infantry. The Orc light cavalry, who had previously retreated in a panic, had effectively covered their advance. Montlet's face turned pale, and he hurriedly ordered preparations for battle. "Form ranks. Form ranks, get into formation, everyone back to your positions," the officers shouted hoarsely, trying to find their men. But this was an impossible task in a short time. The infantry had already pursued for a long distance, and their initial order had long since vanished. It was in this state that they encountered the charge of the Orc heavy cavalry. The Orc cavalry charged in tight formation, the scene like a hammer smashing into a giant block of cheese. Swoosh, the first unfortunate man appeared, a sharp lance piercing his stomach, sending him flying backward. Then came the second, the third, the fourth. Orc heavy cavalry charged straight through a long corridor of flesh and blood. The moment the two sides clashed, the Orcish army suffered massive casualties. The orcs were tall and strong, riding tall horses, clad in heavy armor, and wielding lances. Together, they weighed half a ton. The force of such a massive charge at over 30 kilometers per hour was something that mere infantry could not withstand. In an instant, the painful sounds of violent collisions and screams of agony filled the battlefield. Countless men were crushed or trampled into piles of mangled flesh by the orc cavalry. Many desperately tried to fight off the charging heavy cavalry with their lances, but the enemy, both rider and horse, were covered in thick armor. A single lance could only inflict negligible damage, and that was only if it managed to strike the enemy's mount or body by chance. The scattered older infantry were no match for such a powerful charge. Most of them were hastily recruited cannon fodder. Their morale soared when things were going well, seemingly unstoppable, but the moment they suffered a setback, their spirits collapsed, turning them into a flock of sheep ready for slaughter. Sir Montlet, in command of the infantry, was driven to madness. The victory he thought was within his grasp had shattered like a beautiful bubble. How could he accept it? He could only swing his greatsword wildly to vent his rage. Bang! The force of the impact on his helmet sent Montlet flying, his entire body spinning before crashing heavily to the ground. An orc heavy cavalryman had just aimed at him, but fortunately, the terrible lance had only grazed the edge of Montlet's helmet. The orc didn't have time to turn back and continued chasing his next target. Lying on the ground, Montlet saw stars, and all he could think about was the dizziness. Sir, he was soon helped to his feet. Knights from the Tavares family had come to his rescue. Where is my army? Where is my army? I must regroup my army, Montlet shouted, looking around, but seeing only corpses strewn everywhere. Further away, orc cavalry and human infantry continue their chase. My lord, let's go. We've already lost. Tom and the others have seized some horses. Let's leave before the orcs notice. No, I must protect Her Highness. Where is Her Highness? But the family knights wouldn't allow him to speak. Several men grabbed him and fled in panic. On the other side of the battlefield, the original left flank of the Alder army, was a cavalry force composed of knights from all over Black Rock Plains. These knights were supposed to be there to rescue Montlet's central army when it was attacked by orc heavy cavalry. However, the orc light cavalry swarmed in like a sandstorm, using their agility to hold them off. The knights fought valiantly, but could not break free, and could only watch helplessly as their infantry plunged into the abyss of destruction. Then, annihilation befell the knights. The orc heavy cavalry, having finished off the orc infantry, did not rest, but immediately turned and charged back at them. The knights, initially scattered while pursuing the infantry, quickly regrouped during the maneuver, transforming back into a sharp spearhead. The orc knights, however, were unable to form ranks due to the harassment of the enemy light cavalry. The scene of hammers striking cheese repeated itself. The orc heavy cavalry effortlessly pierced through the knights' ranks, only to return and charge again. The knights of Black Rock Plains were far stronger than the weak infantry. They inflicted considerable casualties on the orcs, but still could not save themselves, let alone change the course of the battlefield. When Klein and Lester led their flanking cavalry into the battlefield, they witnessed a horrific sight. The infantry phalanx in the center had been annihilated, and the cavalry on the left flank seemed to be on the verge of total destruction. Human soldiers' corpses lay strewn across the ground, and the air reeked of blood. Where is Her Highness? It was clear something terrible had happened. Look, there. Klein looked in the direction Lester pointed and saw the royal banner fluttering there. Surrounding it were densely packed orc armies. Quick! Follow me to rescue Her Highness. The two were extremely anxious upon seeing this and immediately led their cavalry towards the location of the royal banner. Wardler, with all his might, swung the longsword given to him by General Column at his opponent. With a clang, the sword snapped in two. Ha ha ha, a fine blade, he was thrilled, his single eye gleaming as if spitting fire. With a swift swing of the sharp blade, the unarmed enemy had no time to react and had his throat slit. Crimson blood splattered far and wide as the knight fell to the ground in despair. Suddenly, a deafening battle cry erupted. Wardler looked around and saw his own cavalry surging in from all directions. There were light cavalrymen with bows and arrows, and heavy cavalrymen charging menacingly. It seemed the human center and left flank were finished. Wardler secretly breathed a sigh of relief and immediately threw himself back into the battle. To hold off this elite enemy force, he and his men had suffered heavy casualties. Even he himself had a gruesome gash in his chest. Fortunately, the sacrifice was worthwhile. They had finally held off the arrival of their main force. Seeing the human soldiers fighting so bravely, Wardler felt a surge of respect. Chapter 683 Breakthrough. Hell, too late. You've come too late. The great General Callum and his warriors have annihilated your weak army. Ha ha ha. The orc before him was incredibly weak, his eyes gradually losing their luster, but the words that came from his mouth still carried a strong sense of sarcasm. Lester drew his sword from him and kicked him to the ground. The tall body lay limply on the ground, completely lifeless. Austin Klein frowned. This guy, though he spouts nonsense, gives me a bad feeling. Mount up and go support His Highness immediately. Klein and Lester led an army, quietly leaving the camp before dawn. They traversed winding and rugged mountain paths, crossed thorny forests, and after a large detour, finally outflanked the orc army. The orc scouts had a wide reconnaissance range, making the journey both arduous and dangerous. They were very fortunate to have escaped detection, as the enemy's main force was busy attacking the Austin army's main force deployed in the valley. As planned, the army would strike directly at the orcs' rear. At the entrance to Sunset Valley, they encountered a scout unit used by the enemy to guard their rear. The Alder army immediately attacked and annihilated them, with only a few escaping. The enemy's dying taunts spurred them on. Klein's ominous premonition soon came true. When they arrived at the battlefield, panting and exhausted, they were met with a hellish scene. The left flank of the cavalry, supported by Blackrock and local troops, and the infantry phalanx had collapsed. The plain in the center of the valley was littered with scattered Alder soldiers, embarrassingly including many knights, while the orc light and heavy cavalry pursued them like wolves chasing sheep. This was an apt metaphor. The disorganized Alder soldiers were truly like lambs, unable to offer any real resistance. The orc cavalry pursuing them were actually few in number, yet they slaughtered seemingly harmless prey as if playing a game, their posture quite relaxed. Father in heaven, Klein was stunned by the sight before him, praying repeatedly to the Lord of Light that it was all just a dream. Before this, the worst he could have imagined was that the Alder army would be suppressed by the orc cavalry, but their basic formation would remain intact, allowing for a coordinated attack upon his arrival. Now, that coordinated attack was a joke. Her Highness is there. Lester beside him pointed into the distance. Yes, Princess Catherine was there too. Klein remembered the most important thing. If the princess of the mighty Alder Kingdom were to die in the war against the orcs, or be captured, he couldn't even bear to think about it. Following Lester's finger, Klein saw a group of Alder soldiers surrounded by orc cavalry. The banner of the Royal Knights still flew high within their ranks. Her Highness should be all right. All troops, heed my command. Immediately relieve our comrades. This army of 1,500 riders raised their hooves and charged towards the besieged Royal Knights. Callum immediately spotted the uninvited guests and waved his command flag to mobilize his troops to intercept them. But with victory largely secured, everyone was busy looting, plundering valuables, or capturing enemy soldiers to enslave. Callum's army, though victorious, hadn't shaken off the habits typical of armies of the era. Or perhaps it was precisely because of their victory that they acted so brazenly. This resulted in only a few scattered small groups of scouts actually attempting to surround Klein's detachment, posing little obstacle to their advance. As they approached their besieged comrades, Klein vaguely discerned the situation. Besides the Royal Knights, there were also many soldiers from Blackrock Plains, who must have gathered here after being defeated elsewhere. Klein roared, "Prepare to charge," using almost all his strength. The Alder cavalry halted their horses and, in a very short time, formed a tight, orderly formation. There were 3 ranks, each with 500 riders. The orc cavalry besieging the Royal Knights maintained a high level of organization. Upon seeing a human cavalry charge from their flank, a contingent immediately broke off to intercept them. Klein forced himself to remain calm and methodically issued orders. Slow trot. The cavalry spurred their horses forward at a slow, measured pace, like 3 moving stone walls, even the dust they kicked up appearing orderly. Fast trot. The war horses began to accelerate, their hooves clashing loudly. Swift trot. The knights extended their weapons, controlling their mounts as they charged at full speed. The 3 walls began to deform and crumble, but they could still be roughly identified as 3 ranks. They immediately met the orc cavalry who came to intercept them. The 2 groups quickly clashed. The scene of war horses colliding at high speed was not frequent. In fact, just before a collision, one of the riders on the opposing side would often immediately turn their horse around to avoid a direct impact. Most of the carnage occurred when the two sides passed each other, with human and orc cavalry inflicting heavy casualties on each other. Many fell to the ground and were trampled into mincemeat by horses' hooves. The besieged royal knights maintained their high morale. These honor-obsessed knights, mostly from noble families, had received rigorous martial arts training from a young age, excelling in horsemanship, hand-to-hand combat, and archery. Coupled with their excellent armor, their individual combat strength surpassed that of the enemy. Since being besieged, they had repelled countless waves of attacks. The orcs had no other options but to hurl volleys of arrows, and the royal knights, naturally, wouldn't stand idly by, retaliating with their own arrows. Klein, Lester, Catherine, who was preparing to break out and was about to lead the vanguard herself, spotted the finally arriving flanking force and realized their intention to relieve her. A surge of joy rose within her, and she immediately changed her attack direction, turning towards the relief troops. Everyone prepared, gripping their weapons tightly. Kill! At the command, horns sounded. A massive charge of war horses, though lacking formation, was still incredibly powerful. Klein's flank also intensified its assault. The orcs, caught off guard by the attack from two directions, had a breach opened in their encirclement. After a fierce battle, the two kingdom armies finally met up and merged into one. It seems the enemy is least in the northwest. Let's go that way. Catherine immediately agreed with Klein's suggestion. Taking advantage of the fact that most of the enemy was busy loading and pursuing fleeing soldiers, the royal knights fought their way out, finally escaping this hellish situation. Chapter 684 Enemy Army Approaching. Cheers, General. Cheers, Duke. The crystal-clear glasses clinked gently, producing a crisp, melodious sound. Scrudder and Duke Henry Ferdinand of the Northwest each downed their drinks. The Arda Expeditionary Force had just reached Sent, the capital of Duke Manda, where they were taking a short rest. Henry had hosted a banquet for Scrudder as soon as he entered the city. Although he considered it inappropriate, Scrudder didn't want to offend the Duke, so he came prepared. However, the banquet wasn't all about eating and drinking. Amanda Army had accompanied the Arda army on their expedition, and the Duke wanted to discuss related matters with Scrudder. The Ferdinand family, holding the title of Duke, was nominally the highest-ranking family in the Northwest Bay. With the kingdom in trouble, and the incident occurring near their territory, the Duke felt obligated to lend a hand. "Come here, Garrett," a young man was summoned by the Duke, looking at Scrudder with admiration. "General, let me introduce you to Garrett Ferdinand, the finest young man of our family's new generation. He will accompany you on this expedition. Please feel free to use him." Garrett snapped his heels together and gave Scrudder a traditional Arda salute. "General, I will serve you faithfully." Scrudder patted him on the shoulder, encouraging him. "I look forward to your brilliance in the upcoming battles." In fact, during the preparations for the expedition, many families in the Northwest Bay had wanted to send their young sons to the Northwest Army. Viscount Derek Heller of the Heller family was the first to express this desire, and after much persuasion, he finally succeeded. Young noblemen like him were eager to try, upholding a 1,000-year-old tradition, yearning to establish merit in war and seize greater glory and higher titles for themselves and their families. Although Scrudder, with his experience fighting orcs, repeatedly explained the potential risks to them, he could not dampen their strong enthusiasm. In a sense, this was also a form of trust, a trust built in the fighting capabilities of the Arda army. Lakeside Town had to create an unofficial combat system for these men. Although unofficial, to facilitate coordination and command, the naming conventions were kept as consistent as possible with the Arda style, with many independent units named after their place of origin, such as Independent Company of Name. Of course, not just any family's sons or army would be accepted. They had to swear an oath of honor in their family's name to abide by all the regulations of the Arda army and be willing to bear serious consequences for any violations. They also had to prove their ability to secure supplies, or pay a large sum of money for the Arda army to do so. After the business was settled, Henry began chatting with Schroeder, recounting several amusing incidents that had recently occurred in his territory. "General, do you remember Maltz Kent, that usurper? What happened to him? Isn't he buried in Sent? But just a few days ago, we had a thunderstorm here, and a huge bolt of lightning struck his grave. After the storm, the scene, tisk tisk tisk, you didn't see it." Henry took a sip of his drink and said happily, "Maltz's entire grave was blasted flat, leaving only a large crater. The coffin and burial goods were all reduced to dust." Schroeder was somewhat incredulous. "Such a thing happened?" Could it have been done by grave robbers? And the scene was staged afterward, Henry said with certainty. It's true, the gravedigger saw it with his own eyes. He was a dutiful, honest, and reliable man, he wouldn't lie. Schroeder shook his head. It's truly remarkable. Henry, however, felt extremely satisfied and happy. Personally, he had almost lost his dukedom to Maltz. Publicly, it was precisely because of Maltz's actions that the Ferdinand family's prestige plummeted, and their former status in the Northwest Bay was lost. He raised an eyebrow and said, "What does this mean?" "It means that Maltz is a heinous criminal. A simple death is not enough to atone for his sins, so the Lord of Light sent down a lightning bolt to continue punishing him. If I had known this would happen, I shouldn't have given him a grand funeral for the sake of appearances." "What a waste of money, Your Grace." Henry was about to continue humiliating Maltz Kent when he was interrupted by a servant who suddenly arrived. "What happened that makes you so flustered?" The Duke, who was in high spirits, was displeased. "A knight, claiming to be from the Royal Knights, requests an audience with you. He says he brought important intelligence from Blackrock origin." Henry and Schroeder exchanged a glance. The Royal Knights, and from Blackrock origin, the implications were obvious. "Have him wait for me in the small reception room." Half an hour later, a tense atmosphere filled the small reception room of the Duke's mansion. There were only 3 people there, Schroeder, Henry Ferdinand, and the uninvited guest from earlier, a knight named Misso. The knight had finished speaking and fell into an anxious silence. Schroeder's expression was stiff. "I didn't expect that we would face such a terrible situation before we even left the Northwest Bay." Henry was already panicking, gesturing wildly as he asked, "No, are you kidding me? Those barbarians from the steppes who don't even have a written language actually managed to defeat the Royal Knights? Oh, and what about a whole bunch of lords from Blackrock Plains? You just lost like that?" Seeing the knight Misso nod silently, the Duke was on the verge of collapse. The other man's words had painted a terrible picture. After defeating the kingdom's army in Sunset Valley, the Orcish army, utilizing their superior cavalry, swept through the land, plundering and conquering. The lords of Blackrock Plains were no match for them. They were either killed in battle, fled, or surrendered, allowing the Orcish army to grow stronger like a snowball. They often appear unexpectedly, striking your weakest point with a fatal blow. Sometimes you've already set up the battlefield, but the Orcish cavalry have already circled around to the rear to slaughter, causing chaos and demoralization among the frontline troops. When finally able to face them head-on, although the kingdom's soldiers are brave, the orcs' relentless mounted archery harassment will erode their will, amplifying their fear and causing the entire army to collapse. From the helpless and fearful expression on Knight Misso's face, one could imagine how terrible the kingdom's army's recent experiences had been. Schroeder looked at Henry. "Your Grace, we must speed things up. We must stop the Orcish army at the border." "General, you're right," Henry wholeheartedly agreed. After all, Manda was the land east of the Northwest Bay. If they cannot defend themselves from external enemies, the Ferdinand family will be the first to face the storm. Chapter 685 Crossing the River. On the road leading east from Duke Manda, a long column of soldiers stretched out, winding like a giant serpent. The 3rd Infantry Battalion of the Arda Army, under Schroeder's orders, was advancing lightly towards a key location called Silver Moon Fortress. Schroeder, leading the main force and supplies at a slower pace, would arrive later. Intelligence indicated that Silver Moon Fortress was teeming with defeated soldiers from the kingdom, who might be of use to the Arda Army. Battalion Commander Joyce was contemplating a defensive strategy on horseback when the halt of the troops ahead interrupted his thoughts. "Why have we stopped? What happened up ahead?" a soldier reported. "Commander, there's only one bridge across the river ahead, but it's packed with refugees. We can't cross." Joyce frowned deeply. How could they have encountered such a situation? He whipped his horse and spurred it towards the river. Even before reaching it, he passed large throngs of refugees. The refugees, from the east, carrying the elderly and children, carefully with their meager belongings, entered the Northwestern Bay region in constant fear. Some had already suffered the ravages of war, their misery stemming from Orcish armies and the kingdom's insurgents. Others, however, had planned ahead, setting out before the battle even began. Their weary faces suggested they had all endured a less than pleasant journey. Joyce rode to the river bank, where a large, dark mass of people still thronged the opposite bank, waiting, or perhaps scrambling, to cross the only wooden bridge. The closer they got to the bridge's entrance, The more chaotic it became, arguments, shoving, fighting, and crying further slowed the already slow progress. Joyce grew impatient. If this continued, his army would have to wait until tomorrow to cross. And, according to the map, this was the only bridge. In his anxiety, he noticed a troop of knights maintaining order on this side of the bridge, led by a nobleman. Joyce spurred his horse forward and removed his hat. "Good afternoon, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Joyce of the Arda Army greets you." "That damned river," the nobleman cursed hoarsely, but quickly recovered and turned to Joyce. "You are a lieutenant colonel in the Arda Army?" "Excuse me, I was just cursing the river." His tone was somewhat cautious. "Joyce." "Lieutenant Colonel, I am Viscount Yevsen Rossi, the local lord. It is an honor to meet you." Viscount Rossi was about 40 years old, thin, with a neatly trimmed mustache, and appeared refined. He spread his hands, looking helpless. "Your men already said the army needs to cross this river immediately, but as you can see, the situation is dire." "Viscount, I must remind you," Joyce said seriously, "the longer we stay here, the closer the orc army will get to your territory. We must stop them before tragedy strikes." Viscount Rossi looked utterly distraught. "Lieutenant Colonel, of course I know that. All my knights have been deployed here to maintain order, just so you can cross quickly." "No, that's not enough," Joyce suggested. "Have those crowding onto the bridge on the other side stop immediately. Those who haven't crossed yet should wait until we do." "But," Viscount Rossi glanced at the throng, "they're being very irrational right now. Nothing we say will work." Hearing this, Joyce frowned and stared at the opposite bank for a moment. "Viscount," Joyce pointed to a row of objects in the distance, "do you see that? Do you know what it is?" Although it was covered with cloth, Viscount Rossi recognized it. He swallowed hard. "That looks like what Arda called cannons." "Yes, Viscount," Joyce said. "My orders are to reach the designated location within the specified time. I will clear any obstacles to complete the mission." His tone turned cold. "If this bridge is still packed with refugees in another hour, I will use the cannons to clear a path." You can't do that." Viscount Rossi was startled by Joyce's words. "They are all citizens of the kingdom. I'm doing this to prevent a greater tragedy." Joyce's gaze was piercing, giving Viscount Rossi a feeling that this hothead would actually do it. "Please wait a moment." He immediately turned and ran to his group of knights. "No need to continue clearing the river. Get them to open the bridge immediately." "Huey, done. Get a few more men to swim to the other side and tell the people that the army is crossing the river. Those who haven't reached the bridge yet, stay where you are and don't move." "But," the leading knight hesitated, "will they obey so readily?" "Then beat them into submission," Viscount Rossi suddenly shouted. "A beating is much better than being blasted into pieces." "Yes, yes." The knight hurried off to find someone. Joyce and the other officers waited anxiously by the river for the outcome. Those already on the bridge continued to cross, but suddenly a commotion arose in the opposite crowd. Clearly, the Lord's order had been delivered. The previously dense crowd began to loosen, and the bridge entrance suddenly became empty. "Bugler, sound the horn to assemble. We're crossing the river now." With the bridge finally clear, the 3rd Infantry Battalion quickly crossed the wooden bridge to the other side of the river and continued eastward. The next day, they finally reached their destination, Silver Moon Keep. They discovered that the so-called Silver Moon Keep was abandoned, reduced to ruins. Relying on this abandoned fortress to defend against the orcs was clearly impossible. Retreat? No. Silver Moon Keep was flanked by dense, ferocious forests. Only by passing through here could they continue towards the northwest bay. They had to hold this place. They couldn't let it fall to the enemy. Joyce, a former squire of Schroeder, had sworn not to tarnish his knightly honor. He had to help him win this battle. At that moment, a scout reported, "A large force has appeared ahead. I don't know if they're fleeing soldiers or Orcish vassals. They'll hide us in an hour." "What? So soon?" The entire 3rd Battalion was thrown into chaos. "Don't be afraid," Joyce shouted sharply. "Everyone, just perform as you normally would in training." Under his strict supervision, the men quickly calmed down and swiftly took their positions, 3 ranks in the front, back, and middle. They waited quietly for the enemy to come. Chapter 686 Preparations for the Blockade. The 3rd Infantry Battalion encountered a routed army. "Commander, the Orcish army is rapidly approaching. We must continue a retreat, but my orders are to hold Silver Moon Keep." "Silver Moon Keep? You mean that pile of rubble? It can't be held." The 3rd Infantry Battalion commander, Joyce, was arguing with Sir Heinkel, whom they had just encountered. He was originally a local lord of Blackrock Plains. Logically, the lord should be the commander of this routed army, but in reality, few of the terrified soldiers would obey his orders. Only those he had brought from his own territory still followed him. The Royal Knights? Perhaps they are still behind me, perhaps they have already been wiped out, or perhaps they have retreated to the safety of the west. I don't know where they are. The orcs have separated us, and we have lost contact. The orcs are right behind us. I refuse to fight them until Crystal Radiance sends stronger reinforcements. After pouring out his pessimism, Heinkel mounted his horse and rode off hastily. Joyce was disappointed. He had hoped to use Heinkel's identity to gather more fleeing soldiers to assist in the upcoming battle. But now he had to rely on himself. The 3rd Infantry Battalion set up checkpoints at the crossroads to gather the fleeing soldiers. By evening, including the kingdom's troops already at Silver Moon Keep, the battalion had gathered nearly 2,000 men. To ensure these soldiers had enough to eat, Joyce borrowed a batch of rations from the surrounding villages and towns. However, the quartermaster sent to borrow the rations wrote IOUs to everyone, to be repaid at 10% above market value after the war. This was a strategy decided before departure. To prevent the need for supplies from greatly exceeding expectations, the troops at the front were authorized to procure supplies flexibly. Of course, if they won, the older army would definitely repay the borrowed supplies as promised. On the other hand, to prevent the IOUs from becoming worthless, the creditors had better support the older army in winning the war. The officers and soldiers of the older army spent their first day at Silver Moon Keep in a tense and busy manner. On the next day, scouts reported that a small cavalry force had charged into Silver Moon Keep. Judging from their physical characteristics, they were undoubtedly orcs. The attacking force numbered around 1,000, likely conducting reconnaissance. Joyce immediately ordered the entire army to prepare for battle. After a day and night of frantic work, the Arda army constructed a simple defensive fortification on the ruins of Silver Moon Keep. They built a 4-foot-high breastwork out of stone bricks, placing barricades and other obstacles in front of it. Silver Moon Keep sat atop a high slope, with a road below, which the enemy would inevitably have to pass through. The soldiers stood behind the breastwork, ready to unleash devastating fire once the enemy entered firing range. 8 6-pound cannons would provide powerful fire support, their dark muzzles protruding from the breastwork, menacingly pointing towards the road below. If the enemy braved the heavy fire to break through the breastwork, the Arda soldiers, armed with bayonets and spears, would engage them in hand-to-hand combat. With everything prepared, Joyce set up his telescope atop a still-standing tower, awaiting the orcs' arrival. What a pleasant journey, said Amur, the centurion leading the vanguard, to his lieutenant, Bear. I expected fierce battles, but the human army is surprisingly weak. Bear agreed with his superior. The great chieftain is too cautious. If we had entered earlier, perhaps the entire Alder would be under the iron heel of the orc cavalry, Amor said with some regret. Rather than continuing this journey, I'd rather encounter those guys from Crystal Radiance. If we could capture the Alder princess, that would be the greatest achievement of this southward expedition. Although 1,000 cavalrymen is a small force, Amor's orders were to infiltrate human territories from behind, creating the illusion that the orc army had penetrated deep into their territory, thus inciting widespread panic and chaos. The orcs' plan was successful. Many minor lords, upon hearing of the defeat at Sunset Valley, were already in a state of extreme panic. At the first sign of orc cavalry activity, they would often abandon their territories and flee, while the common people were even more paranoid. Bayer turned his gaze westward. Perhaps you will be the first general to see the western coast of Alder, which would be a great honor. I think it will happen soon. The road ahead is so smooth, no lord can withstand our army. They will only flee. He suddenly fell silent, because on the high slope ahead, the Alder banner was flying high, along with another banner, a red banner embroidered with a dragon. Oh, Lord Amur, it seems we've met a tough nut to crack. Let me see. Amur shielded his eyes from the cloak and peered ahead. My bones are itching. Finally, I can have another good battle. Hey. Come here. Amur summoned his human guide. My lord, this is Silver Moon Keep, his human guide replied obsequiously. However, it's said that the local lords have long since moved to the town, and the castle used for defense has long been abandoned. Is that so? Amur raised an eyebrow. Those damp and cold castles built by humans are certainly not good places to live, he commanded. Take another look. As the orc cavalry continued to advance, they soon discovered that, as the guide had said, the main part of the castle had collapsed and was now just a pile of rubble. But as they approached, chevaux de frise, spiked stakes, and the low breastwork came into view. Ha! Trying to stop us with these things? That's laughable. Amor and Bayer burst into laughter. They had devised a battle plan long ago. Devoured is a bit of an exaggeration, as the plan was practically ready-made. Under the cover of arrows, the warriors would scale the walls and crush the human soldiers hiding inside, a tactic that had proven incredibly effective against the minor lords. Those minor lords' castles were low and sparsely guarded, making them easy to conquer. Tougher targets were bypassed, left to the main force. But this pile of rubble was clearly not a tough nut to crack. My hands are itching. I'll personally lead the charge. Amor flexed his wrists, eager to try. Bayer, the archers are yours to command, his lieutenant readily agreed. The orcs quickly began their attack. Chapter 687 The Battle of Silver Moon Fortress. A whoosh. The sound of horns echoed across the plains, stirring the nerves of everyone present. The orc warriors, dressed in their finest attire, assembled before Silver Moon Keep. Judging by their appearance alone, they certainly had reason to be proud. Their nearly 2-meter tall figures, clad in armor, appeared even more imposing and majestic. The orcs bared their teeth and brandished their claws, shouting insults at the defenders in broken older slang, their hands also busy striking various obscene gestures. 500 orc warriors, led by Amor, would carry out the assault, while another 500 would provide cover with bows and arrows. The orcs used several types of bows and arrows. When mounted, they used short bows, light, agile, and easy to control, but with a shorter range and less power. When they chose to fight on foot, they would switch to longbows and large arrows. Their longbows were similar in design to those of the human world, nearly the length of an adult male, with a long range and great power, even capable of piercing thin metal armor. Amor looked at the dilapidated fortress, a slight sense of unease creeping into his heart. During their westward journey, they had encountered human warriors who dared to resist. But when insulted, these warriors would often shout back. These enemies before him, however, remained silent as stone statues, utterly silencing their attacks. This made their verbal assault seem like punches landing on cotton. Don't waste your energy, Amor decided. He raised his hand, and his men, who had been shouting insults, immediately ceased. Warriors of the steppe, before battle, Amor always gave a speech to boost morale, though he considered it superfluous for this particular engagement. But he was a man of ritual, and he couldn't skip any of the necessary steps. Under the guidance of the royal tent, we have been invincible, triumphant all the way. You have already witnessed that those cowardly humans are no match for us, but look at that pile of rubble behind me. A small group of overconfident fools dared to try and block the advance of the steppe warriors. It's laughable, and now, I, Amor, your centurion, will personally lead you to crush these arrogant ants, letting them experience the biting chill of the steppe winds. Inspired by him, the orcs' blood boiled, their eyes blazing with battle lust. Kill them, plunder them. Each man raised his weapon, roaring various slogans, his face contorted with rage. Archers, Amor waved his hand. Crack, crack, crack. The archers, heads held high, approached Silver Moon Fortress, their steady footsteps echoing loudly on the ground. They would use their precise and deadly archery to suppress the human defenders inside, covering their comrades' attack. Behind the breastwork, Joyce nervously watched the enemy approach, every cell in his body throbbing with excitement. When he was a young knight squire, he had followed Schroeder in fighting the orcs at Watcher's Fortress. At that time, the royal court on the plains was beginning to demonstrate its dominance, and tribes large and small were starting to change their previously fragmented state. Therefore, Joyce knew well the formidable fighting power of a united orc. When news of the fall of Watcher's Fortress arrived, he felt a sense of relief, as if this day has finally come. What he had sworn to protect with his life had become the enemy's, and from Watcher's Fortress westward, the enemy's iron hoods had already ravaged one kingdom after another. A surge of rage welled up in Joyce's chest. Watching the orc archers approach step by step, he struggled to suppress his anger, patiently waiting for them to enter their effective firing range. The 3rd Infantry Battalion of the Arda Army had been re-equipped with a Model 1905 rifle 6 months ago. This rifle, which underwent several iterations and finally received an official designation, was a formidable killing machine. Although the Model 1905 was still a traditional smoothbore musket, thanks to Arda's increasingly improved quality control, it could inflict effective damage on the enemy at a range of 200 yards. Well-trained soldiers could maintain a hit rate of over 60% within 90 yards, and the overall hit rate would be even higher if the enemy faced the Arda army in a dense formation. As for the 6 12-pound cannons, they were now all loaded with shotgun shells. According to regulations, Joyce should have bombarded the enemy with artillery when they were about 1 kilometer away to prevent them from forming an effective formation. However, he planned to take advantage of the orcs' lack of knowledge about firearms and inflict a heavy loss on them. Greeting these uninvited guests with a hail of shotgun shells was undoubtedly a good choice. As the orc archers advanced, they finally approached within about 500 yards of the breastwork. Joyce waited patiently until the orc archers closed another 200 yards, followed by orc warriors armed with weapons. The effective range of the orc longbow was about 160 yards, and the archers silently estimated the distance, some already knocking arrows. Boom! Boom! 2 flashes of light appeared, followed by deafening roars like muffled thunder. Thick smoke instantly rose from the ruins of Silver Moon Keep, quickly engulfing the fortress. The orc archers at the front fell to the ground, as if swept away by an invisible broom. Painful screams rang out almost immediately as they writhed on the ground, as if enduring the cruelest tortures of hell. Shock gripped the mind of Centurion Amur, making it difficult for him to accept. This can't be, he thought he was seeing things. Just now, the first to fire were the number 3 and number 4 gun positions of the 3rd Battalion of the Arda Army. Because of the close proximity, the shrapnel fire was quite effective, wiping out almost all of the orc archers in the first 2 ranks. Although still confused about what was happening, the archers in the rear reacted quickly, their instincts kicking in, immediately hurling arrows and turning to run. This wasn't their optimal firing range, especially given the hasty nature of the attack. The arrow rain was sparse and ineffective. Boom! Boom! 2 more cannons fired, and another large number of the orc archers who had already turned fell. Humans have used black magic, the orc soldiers who witnessed this exclaimed in alarm. But Amur, the commander, saw that, accompanied by muffled thunder, numerous black dots shot out from the smoke, striking his own archers. He immediately realized that the dark tubes protruding from the breach in the breastwork were a new weapon. The 4 tubes that had already emitted sparks retracted, and figures seemed to move behind the smoke. They must be performing some kind of operation, and it was highly likely they wouldn't be able to fire again in a short time. He immediately realized this. Charge! Amur raised his longsword, ordering the charge. This was a golden opportunity. If they could withstand the remaining 2 waves, they could scale the breastwork and kill the humans hiding behind it. Moreover, the soldiers leading the assault were heavily armored. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 688 The Battle of Silver Moon Fortress 2. Warriors of the Great Plains. Charge! Amur raised his longsword and charged ahead on horseback. Although the humans had inflicted heavy casualties on the archers in ways they couldn't comprehend, his desperate men remained ferocious, charging forward with roars under their commander's lead. The orcs, clad in heavy armor, trampled the slope, and the humans behind the breastwork could even feel the ground trembling. Behind the Arda soldiers stood the soldiers of other kingdoms, spear in hand, still reeling from the shock of what had just happened. The orcs' archery was ruthless and accurate, leaving an indelible impression of terror on them. In previous battles, no matter how well organized their formations were, they would be shattered by wave after wave of arrows. But now, those fearsome archers seemed to have met their match. It was a weapon called a cannon by the Northwesterners, spewing terrifying tongues of fire forward, and those devilish giants fell one after another, lying on the ground howling in agony. But the armored orcs charged again. Were the weapons of the Northwesterners still effective? Fire, with spitting flames and deafening explosions, countless gray-white flowers bloomed in front of the breastwork, quickly forming a wall of smoke that obscured the entire front of Silver Moon Keep. The orcs who had charged within 100 meters were met with a first volley of musket fire from the Arda army, and were immediately thrown into disarray. Their sturdy armor did not work as expected, tearing through like fragile cloth before the rapidly approaching lead bullets. Clumps of blood mist erupted from the orcs' proud, imposing bodies, before they were knocked to the ground by the immense kinetic energy. Amor, the commander, felt a sense of dread. Just moments before, out of the corner of his eye, he had caught a glimpse of a soldier running ahead of him whose head had suddenly flown off, transforming into an indescribable mass, before his body collapsed to the ground, out of control. Amor instinctively dropped to the ground, and a small object stained with fresh blood rolled to his side. He reached out and picked it up, his face filled with disbelief. The small object was clearly made of metal. It had originally been a fairly regular circle, but now it was somewhat irregular, likely caused by the skull of one of his men. Such an inconspicuous little metal piece, not even as sharp as an arrowhead, had so easily taken the life of an orc warrior? At that moment, a pungent, foul odor filled his nostrils, making him dizzy. He snapped out of his daze, turning and shouting, "Take cover!" Before his words even finished, a burst of fire suddenly erupted from the thick smoke ahead. Now Amor knew what had harmed them. Those deadly little bullets whizzed through the air. Thud! Thud! Many soldiers who hadn't had time to take cover were hit, and Amor was heartbroken. Faced with a terrifying weapon unknown to humankind, he was forced to make a painful decision. Retreat. On the Arda army's side, although the thick smoke from the volley severely impaired the soldiers' visibility, the observation posts on the towers still spotted the orcs retreating and promptly reported to Battalion Commander Joyce. It seems their commander is very cautious. 2 12-pound cannons hadn't fired yet, and with the 2 that had just been reloaded after their first firing. Joyce had originally planned a 4-cannon volley to inflict heavy damage on the orcs. Since the orcs were retreating, he immediately ordered the artillery to fire downhill. After a series of muffled thunderous roars, countless shrapnel shells pierced through the smoke and rained down on the retreating orcs. After suffering heavy casualties again, the orcs finally returned to their starting point. "Lord Amor, why retreat? If we had advanced a little further, we would have reached that low wall. Yes, once we get over it, no matter how amazing the human weapons are, they will be at our mercy." Although the orc soldiers, who had suffered heavy losses, were shocked by the unfamiliar weapons, they remain fierce and warlike, their fighting spirit high. "Shut up. We're the vanguard, the eyes of the entire army," Amor rebuked them. "If we encounter any tough opponents, we must immediately inform the brothers behind us." Instead of adding to the casualties, he gestured rapidly. You, and you, immediately ride the fastest horse and inform the army of what just happened. They might encounter this terrifying weapon elsewhere. Tell them to be extra vigilant." "Yes, Commander," the 3 soldiers responded and hurried off. "Commander, so many soldiers have sacrificed themselves. Are we just going to bypass this place, or wait for the army to come and avenge us?" Many of his men longed to take revenge themselves. "Oh no, of course we can't let them get away with it, even temporarily." A cunning and cruel glint flashed in Amor's eyes. "Take a small squad and go to the surrounding villages and towns, gather some civilians. We need to thoroughly test this new human weapon and gather as much intelligence as possible for the army." The subordinate who had just asked the question was overjoyed. "Lord Amor, no wonder you're a commander." He was about to turn and leave to carry out the order when a loud rumbling sound suddenly erupted from the high ground. Whoosh! 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 A flurry of dark shadows, accompanied by sharp whistles, arrived in an instant, too fast for the orcs to react. Thud! The projectile slammed into the ground in front of Amor, then bounced up again. "Ah!" His retreating subordinate screamed and fell to the ground, one of his legs broken. "Oh, spirit of the grasslands! No, no!" Watching his subordinate writhe on the ground in agony, Amor's hair stood on end. He clearly saw that the humans had launched metal projectiles much larger than the small metal blocks from before. About the size of a fist, each one was far more powerful than the smaller ones, bouncing repeatedly on the ground, killing or injuring any orc soldiers that touched them. The orcs' mounts, also suffering such an attack for the first time, neighed in terror and scattered in all directions. Chaos reigned on the battlefield. "Continue the retreat. Get away from here," Amor shouted the order. He now understood, the humans could have attacked his troops the moment they arrived. Their initial reluctance was a ploy to lure the orcs up the slope to their deaths. How despicable. He and his men raced away from Silver Moon Fortress, all the while pondering, how could human weapons travel such a distance? Was it a catapult? Or a ballista? No, catapults and ballistae wouldn't produce that terrifying, muffled thunderous sound, nor would they create thick smoke or flames. Wait, thick smoke? Flames? A flash of insight struck Amor. Weren't these all characteristics of legendary magic? Chapter 689 Sniping. As night fell, the clamor of battle temporarily subsided over the land near Silver Moon Keep. The orcs set up camp 3 miles from the fortress. Looking at the distant lights, Amur sighed heavily. Chief, a subordinate approached him, his voice filled with worry. I feel Lord Bayhorn is dying. Amur turned immediately. Take me to see him quickly. He followed a subordinate briskly to a tent in the camp, took a few deep breaths, and crawled inside. A strong smell of herbs mixed with an equally strong stench of pus and blood filled Amur's nostrils. Of course, for a seasoned military commander, this was not unbearable. Inside the tent, a hide-covered mat was laid out, and a weak figure lay on it. Amur went to his side, knelt down solemnly, and grasped the man's hand. His body temperature was alarmingly high. This was what Amur sensed from Bayhorn. During the day, Bayhorn, his second-in-command, led the archers in an initial assault on the human positions. The archers suffered heavy losses from the first wave of attacks, countless deadly metal projectiles piercing their thighs. Bayhorn, the commander, was wounded. A projectile pierced his thigh. A nearby soldier immediately hoisted him up and desperately pulled him away from the battlefield. Bayhorn lost a lot of blood and developed a high fever by evening, drifting in and out of consciousness. Amur frowned at his second-in-command. Just as the soldier had said, his condition was dire. Bayhorn squinted, an unnatural flush rising to his face, fine beads of sweat forming on his forehead, while his lips were pale and bloodless. Oh, my brother, Amur uttered a sorrowful sound. Bayhorn struggled to open his eyes slightly. Please, Lord Amur, burn my body to ashes and scatter them on the grasslands of my homeland. Amur shook his head. How could such a minor ailment defeat the strong orc warrior Bayhorn? Take good care of your injuries, and I will ride back to the grasslands with you, carrying the spoils of war. Cough cough. Bayhorn's coughs revealed his weakness. Amur, I have something to say to you, especially to you alone. Amur gestured to those around him. You two go out first. Once only the two of them were left in the tent, Bayhorn forced himself to continue. My remaining sanity tells me that our army is incredibly powerful, capable of sweeping away at least half of the Alder Kingdom and securing a vast expanse of fertile, sun-drenched land for the orcs. But ever since I was wounded, I've been having recurring nightmares. In these nightmares, the spirit of the grasslands reveals a horrific scene to me. Amur's heart churned. What scene? The human army storms into the grasslands, indiscriminately slaughtering and driving away our people with those terrible weapons we've seen today. How could that be? It seems your second-in-command has truly lost his mind, Amur concluded. He had assumed the worst-case scenario would be the orcs encountering fierce resistance and being forced to retreat back to the grasslands. But to allow what he perceived as an incredibly weak human army to storm into the grasslands and slaughter the orcs was something he had never imagined. Suppressing his inner turmoil, Amur comforted him. Take good care of yourself and don't think about such things. I'll go check on the other wounded warriors. He lifted the tent flap and went outside. The daytime battle had resulted in the deaths of over 100 and wounded over 200 men in the vanguard of more than 1,000 men, with many of the wounded facing dire straits. The casualties were devastating. Unlike Bayhorn, the other wounded did not have individual tents. They were crammed into several large tents. Amur surveyed the wounded. Many, like Bayhorn, had developed high fevers and fallen into comas, while others had had their arms or legs sawed off, leaving them crippled. He walked dejectedly out of the wounded's quarters, the night breeze bringing fresh air and finally dispelling the stench of herbs and pus. Incredible, Sir Joyce. Your methods of warfare are truly impressive, said Sir Rentria, carrying a bowl of hot soup, speaking with admiration. The Arda army had gathered a group of routed soldiers, and Rentria was appointed as the temporary commander of this force. He himself was also a member of the fleeing soldiers. Unlike Heinkel, who had escaped, Rentria, though still pessimistic, decided to stay and assist the Arda army. During the day, Rentria had thought he was going to die there. The Northwesterners might have been sent by the Lord of Light to correct his deviation from the path of chivalry. But he hadn't expected to be saved. The Northwesterners' strange weapon suppressed the orcs' frenzied attack, inflicting heavy losses on these arrogant creatures. Joyce, sitting opposite him, smiled slightly. Believe me, Knight Rentria, as long as we unite, we can make those guys suffer even more. I didn't have time to ask during the day because of the tense battle, but now I want to inquire about the royal army and Princess Catherine. Rentria frowned. My lord and I retreated with the royal army, but we got separated on the road while breaking through an orc encirclement. They might be entangled by the enemy. Joyce felt a pang of worry. Perhaps the Arda army should venture deeper into the Black Rock Plains to find Princess Catherine? After all, she was not only the kingdom's princess, but also his future mistress. The night passed in mutual vigilance between the warring sides, and dawn broke once more. As the morning mist dissipated, a scene unfolded on the land before Silver Moon Keep that filled the Orcish army with rage. The orcs launched another attack, but they had abducted a large number of human civilians to use as human shields, advancing step by step towards their own lines. Joyce was furious and immediately ordered snipers equipped with rifled muskets to shoot down the orc soldiers driving away the civilians. The order was quickly carried out. The human lines ceased their cannon barrage, replaced by sporadic gunfire. The orc overseers mixed among the civilians quickly paid a heavy price, bullets striking their bodies and claiming their lives. Amur, watching from afar, was astonished. Could human weapons achieve such precise kills from such a distance? He broke out in a cold sweat. If the enemy had recognized him as the leader of this attack yesterday, wouldn't he be in grave danger? Upon discovering that their escorts were all dead, the human civilians, who had been used as human shields, erupted in chaos and scattered in all directions. While orcs were dangerous, the kingdom's army, being human, wasn't necessarily safe either. Sorry for visiting relatives so much lately. Chapter 690 Taking the Initiative. Stop their escape, Amur roared, brandishing his greatsword. The orc soldiers around him immediately drew their bows and opened fire, slaughtering the fleeing human civilians. Screams echoed across the battlefield as countless people fell to the ground, orcs and civilians alike. Joyce frowned. I need you to hold this place for now. The Lentrianite was utterly astonished. What do you mean? You're going out to fight? Yes, I advise you to be cautious. Thank you. Joyce still gave the order, and the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion leaped over the breastwork to form ranks. Amur laughed heartily. These foolish humans, without the protection of the fortress, how could they possibly stand against their steppe warriors? Warriors, assemble. Our moment of glory has arrived. Roar. Roar. A chorus of howls rose and fell around them. The orc warriors, eyes wide, blazed with fury, vowing to avenge yesterday's humiliation. They ignored the fleeing human civilians and began to assemble, preparing for close combat. A rhythmic drumbeat echoed across the Orcish ranks, as soldiers marched to the beat. So orderly, Amur exclaimed in amazement. Did the human commander have obsessive-compulsive disorder? He must have put in a tremendous amount of effort in training them. He had fought in Sunset Valley, and even the Royal Army from Crystal Radiance couldn't achieve such perfect discipline during a march. Warriors, advance! The orcs sprang into action at his command. Boom! Boom! To Amur's surprise, the strange weapon atop Silver Moon Keep roared again. Whoosh! Before they could dodge, several dark figures leaped into the orc ranks, bouncing and causing further casualties. The ranks were immediately thrown into chaos. Remembering yesterday's lesson, the soldiers almost instinctively scattered. These lunatics! Aren't they afraid of hitting their own men? Amur was both shocked and furious. If he were commanding a ballista, he would never have fired when the two sides were so close. Who knew who would be hit? He gave the signal, ordering the troops to regroup. But whenever a large number of soldiers gathered in one place, deadly iron bullets would immediately whistle in, forcing them to disperse again. To Amur's surprise, the human weapons fired repeatedly without hitting their own men once. Such precision! The Arda artillery was divided into 3 groups, firing alternately to ensure a relatively continuous barrage. Because they usually maintained a smaller scale, they had ample ammunition to hone their skills. The artillerymen accompanying the expedition were all highly skilled veterans. Moreover, before the orc army arrived, the artillery had conducted detailed surveys and experimental firing on the area in front of Silver Moon Fortress, possessing readily available data on the appropriate elevation angle and explosive charge at what distance. The battlefield presented a scene where the Orcish army was tightly organized, while the orcs were chaotic and scattered, approaching each other in drastically different ways. As a commander, Amur could almost foresee the consequences of continuing. When the two sides truly engaged in close combat, the human weapons would likely cease firing to avoid friendly fire. But so what? The scattered orc soldiers charging forward would inevitably face a dense barrage of spears, bayonets. The steppe warriors were tall, strong, and highly skilled, but with only 2 hands. They were helpless against weapons several times their size thrusting from different directions simultaneously. But Amur still wanted to take the gamble. Private Jose West knelt on one knee, his palms sweating nervously. He had already aimed at an orc soldier, just waiting for the order. Fire, snap. He instinctively pulled the trigger, without even thinking. The vicious fellow collapsed to the ground 60 feet away, never to rise again. He breathed a sigh of relief, his body instincts prompting him to immediately reload. The second platoon of soldiers fired overhead, and several more orcs charging forward were felled. When Battalion Commander Joyce ordered the advance into battle, Jose's heart was in his throat, half from tension, half from fear. After all, he had only been in the army for a little over a year and had never experienced real combat. But an order is an order, and Jose followed his unit step by step toward the orcs. His artillery comrades behind him were reliable, the continuous fire kept the long-haired bastards from huddling together. It was the whooshing sound of shells flying overhead that was terrifying. Jose couldn't help but shrink back every time he heard it. Fortunately, he was trained, so his legs weren't too weak to move. The veterans around him, however, didn't seem to care. In the Arda army, infantry-artillery coordination was a crucial training subject. Lord Gleman required that artillery fire accompany infantry attacks, preventing the enemy from approaching in tight formations. Of course, the premise was that it couldn't hit friendly fire. Jose mechanically fired again and again, but unfortunately, he ran into trouble, his gun misfired. Damn it, a son of a bitch was charging at him. Thud, as he stood there stunned, his comrade stabbed the orc in the neck with a bayonet. It might have punctured a major artery, because foul-smelling blood sprayed all over Jose's face. He vomited. Amar's eyes almost blazed with rage. He had lost his gamble. He hated Silver Moon Keep, hated the stamped slope, but what he hated most was the unfamiliar human army before him. Many warriors charged close enough to be killed, unable to cover each other. As the fighting raged ahead, the weapons behind the breastworks didn't cease firing, but continued to threaten the troops behind, forcing the orcs into a piecemeal fighting strategy. What angered him even more was that the warriors' bravery was useless. The human soldiers, like ducks in a lake, mowed them down one by one with their firearms. Those who managed to reach them were overwhelmed by a hail of bayonets. The only consolation was that some warriors temporarily switched to bows and arrows, inflicting some casualties on the enemy. Retreat, he had to make the painful decision. The orcs retreated, this time truly retreating. Because the enemy was on horseback, Joyce didn't pursue. He led his soldiers back to Silver Moon Keep, greeted by their cheers. The Knights of Lentria looked at him with increasing admiration. His artillery commander, Bastion, looked relieved. He asked, puzzled, "What's wrong? The cannon barrels are getting too hot to handle. If the fighting continues, we'll have to suspend our support." Joyce stammered, his face even flushing slightly. He'd completely forgotten this while commanding the battle. Real combat is different from regular drills. People forget many things when they're tense and excited. Thank goodness the Lord of Light helped the orcs retreat. Although he was certain that even if the artillery was forced to stop, the soldiers could still repel the orcs with their muskets and bayonets. The two sides were roughly equal in size, and while the orcs outnumbered them, they didn't pose a crushing threat. But allowing the enemy to attack in formation would undoubtedly increase casualties. He had to consider this carefully in the future. Chapter 691 Discussion of Crystal Radiance. The Battle of Silver Moon Keep allowed the Orcish army to overcome the Orcish reconnaissance forces. However, this did not halt the overall decline on the battlefield. A day after the battle, Schroeder arrived with his main force, along with troops from Arda and various lords, totaling over 6,000 men. This greatly strengthened Silver Moon Keep's defenses, finally easing Joyce's anxieties. To their delight, a day later, the Royal Knights, who had retreated from Black Rock Plains, also arrived, including Princess Catherine. "Your Highness," Schroeder led Joyce to kneel on one knee, bowing to Catherine, the old knight's voice tinged with emotion. "It's been a long time, esteemed Knight Schroeder. I should now address you as Sir." Catherine and Schroeder had known each other for many years, at Watcher's Fortress. Meeting in this setting evoked a complex mix of emotions. Silver Moon Keep, now in ruins, quickly became a large construction site, with soldiers, laborers, and recruits from the surrounding area beginning to rebuild the fortress. The group held their first joint meeting in a newly tidied room. "You should issue an order prohibiting the troops that have retreated here from continuing their westward escape," Schroeder pleaded with the princess, and Catherine agreed. It was time to organize a second resistance. Inside the tent, The orc general Callum coldly stared at Amur, who knelt on the ground. "You're really not lying, you wouldn't dare even if you gave me 1,000 lives." Amur reported his experiences at Silver Moon Keep, including the strange weapons. Callum narrowed his eyes. The main force of the army, led by the war chief, had already entered the human world, and the orc warhorses were galloping across the vast northeastern plains of the Alder. Generals were vying to conquer cities and territories, and his mission was to keep fighting westward until he saw the sea, or until he could no longer advance. But Callum didn't believe that their current forces could only reach Silver Moon Keep. A small scout team had been defeated, it was no big deal. He picked up his wine cup, gulped it down, and wiped his mouth. "Let's go, let's see if the warriors' swords of the steppes are more powerful, or if human firearms are superior." Crystal Radiance's recent situation is dire, with bad news arriving one after another. The fall of Watcher's Fortress, the betrayal of the Bradley family, the defeat at Sunset Valley. The young King Rodney's VIE is overwhelmed with worry. At the Royal Council, a group of ministers share the king's furrowed brows. Some are relaxed, even secretly pleased. The annihilation of the knightly order led by Princess Catherine isn't necessarily a bad thing. "Your Majesty," Lord Chamberlain Rupert suggests, "since we have military scrip from the Northwest Bay, let's quickly organize a large army." "You're right." The king looks at his younger brother, Orico. "How's your work going?" The young man has shed some of his frivolity, his eyes filled with enthusiasm, as if he has finally found a cause to strive for. He stands up and bows to his brother. "The army is expanding. We've recruited nearly 5,000 men in just 1 month, and my goodness, new soldiers are still pouring into the camps. The military scrip method is brilliant. Those starving civilians, after actually buying food with the scrip, are rushing to enlist." The king nodded. "Good, not bad, but they must be trained well. Courage, discipline, and combat skills are all indispensable. I don't want to just recruit a bunch of good-for-nothings, rest assured, Your Majesty." Yuriko nodded heavily. Rodney's VIE felt a little relieved. If the elite of the Royal Knights were truly wiped out, he was worried not only about the orcs but also about the 2 nominal vassals in the south. The group continued discussing the situation. Earl Merlin pointed at a map. If it were merely the loss of the Yellow Earth, the orcs would lack room to maneuver, as the southern mountains still blocked their path. But if they occupy the Black Rock Plains and continue eastward to the Elephant Plains, below lies the Thornlands adjacent to the royal domain, separated only by a golden river. The orcs could then pour down like a flood, further inundating the rich southern part of the kingdom. The Earl's words sent a chill down everyone's spine. "It's all Catherine's fault. She's utterly useless," Prince Yuriko said angrily. "Why couldn't she have stopped the orcs at the Yellow Earth?" Many cast disapproving glances at the prince. "All right, we can't entirely blame Catherine," Prince Jassim defended his niece. "After all, no one anticipated the Bradley family's betrayal, which practically handed over the entire Yellow Earth to the orcs." As the discussion continued, a servant hurried in and handed the king a letter. Rodney's VIE read it, and his brow immediately relaxed. "Gentlemen, the kingdom's army has defeated the Orcish army at Silver Moon Keep, and Catherine has safely retreated there." A murmur of surprise rippled through the court. The king's voice trembled slightly. "Thanks to the merciful Father, and thanks to the valiant Northwesterners." "Northwesterners?" Earl Merlin asked. "Was it Earl Gryle's army?" "Indeed." The king beamed, kissing the letter passionately. His heartfelt words were clear. "My dear Paul, how many miracles will you bring me?" This piqued everyone's interest, their earlier frustration vanishing. "Shouldn't we launch a counterattack?" Many immediately raised this question. But after the letter had been circulated, everyone learned that only a force of about 500 Arda soldiers had defeated 1,000 invading orc cavalrymen thanks to their superior terrain and weaponry. The battle was too small, seemingly insignificant. However, given their repeated defeats, this was indeed good news, especially since Princess Catherine was safe. Rupert said, "Your Highness, gentlemen, I think we need to negotiate with the orcs before the new army is fully assembled." "Negotiate with the enemy? Impossible," the ministers exclaimed. The Chancellor was getting senile. Compromising with Giles was one thing, after all, they were civilized men. Orcs were nothing, a bunch of barbarians who only knew how to fight. Of course, it's not real negotiation. It's delaying them, releasing some smokescreen, trying to slow their offensive. Rupert patiently explained to his colleagues. "I want to go myself to find out what these guys are thinking." Maybe the Bradley family can be brought back to the kingdom's side. The Chancellor's words stirred something within the king. The recent string of bad news deserved a chance for the kingdom to catch its breath. In that case, my dear Chancellor, I appoint you. I'll go. Prince Jassim stood up, declaring without hesitation, the Chancellor is too old. How can he travel such a long distance? Chapter 692 Disciplinary Camp. Schroeder was elected commander of the Orcish army. Due to the fall of Black Rock Plains, Catherine, feeling guilty, declined the position, believing a more experienced general familiar with the kingdom's north should take command. Thus, the position naturally fell to Schroeder, a former commander of Watcher's Fortress and later a high-ranking officer in Arda, making him the popular choice. After discussion, the Orcish army decided to take advantage of the Orcish army's unstable foothold and first recapture Onyx Keep, southeast of Silver Moon Keep, forming a pincer movement. The combined forces of nearly 20,000 men began their eastward advance, declaring a counter-offensive against the Orcs. Onyx Keep was a medium-sized city, garrisoned by 2 Orcish 1,000-man squads and a small number of human rebels who had defected to them. Unfortunately, the first assault failed. This was expected by Schroeder, as the troops used were recently withdrawn from Black Rock Plains. His true objective was to test the Orcs' defensive capabilities. But just as the first wave of soldiers retreated for a brief rest, the Orcs, outnumbered by a large margin, boldly opened the city gates and charged the retreating human army with their cavalry. Chaos erupted on the battlefield, routed soldiers scattered everywhere, delaying the arrival of the Royal Cavalry to their aid. Schroeder was furious and immediately halted the operation. Undoubtedly, the previous series of defeats had cast a deep shadow over these routed soldiers. Without restoring discipline first, nothing else mattered. Line up, stand still, under the continuous, stern shouts and whips of the Arda soldiers, the previously chaotic crowd quickly formed orderly ranks. Schroeder stood on the high platform, glaring fiercely at the group below, his wide-open eyes like the throat of a dragon, ready to spew forth fury at any moment. This 1,000-man unit from Maple Leaf Territory and Black Rock Plains was supposed to provide cover during the retreat, but they fled the moment the Orc cavalry appeared, bearing primary responsibility for the failure of the entire siege. While other units suffered casualties, this army miraculously survived. Their lord had disappeared in the previous battles, and now a knight from the former lord's service was in command, standing among the ranks under Schroeder's strict orders. Your performance on the battlefield has brought shame upon all of Alder, Schroeder roared like a furious old lion. Now, starting with the first man, count off from 1 to 10, repeating the cycle. Every man who shouts 10, step forward. No one dared disobey his will, and the soldiers began to count off in turn. Just as Schroeder commanded, everyone who shouted 10 stepped forward, or rather, was dragged out, including the knight in charge of the unit. A full 100 men stood in a row, surrounded by onlookers. All the officers and soldiers of the Alder army were gathered around the field to watch, whispering and speculating about how Schroeder would punish them. Would he give them a whipping? Or brand them with a red-hot iron? The 100 men who had been pulled out were restless. Some of them already realized that some calamity was about to befall them. What are you doing? Schroeder, you have no right to do this. We have our own lord, the knight in command, sensing impending doom, immediately protested. Aim, a command rang out from the high platform. And the Arda soldiers monitoring them raised their guns. After several days of contact, everyone knew that the Arda soldiers never let go of their weapons. A chorus of fear erupted in the arena. No one had expected the old knight to be so ruthless. No, father, those targeted panicked, crying out incessantly. Some took off running, trying to escape back to their ranks. The knight cried out in despair, I want to see Princess Catherine. I want to see Princess Catherine, but Schroeder had no intention of giving him a chance, immediately ordering, fire. Schroeder, I curse you. A barrage of popping sounds followed, and then white smoke billowed across the arena. A whole row of men were executed by firing squad, their bodies lying haphazardly on the ground, a mixture of blood and brain matter splattering everywhere. The horrific scene immediately stunned all the onlookers. A full 100 men had been executed, not by the Orcs' weapons, but by their own comrades. They looked at Schroeder on the platform. The once dignified old knight seemed to have become the embodiment of a demon. The remaining 900 men of Maple Leaf Territory were terrified, standing frozen in place, trembling. Arda soldiers, armed and ready, surrounded them, prepared to slaughter them at Schroeder's command. You cowards, the old knight said coldly, Looking at them, I can tolerate defeat. It's common on the battlefield, but defeats caused by disregard for discipline cannot be tolerated, especially those who scatter without resistance, ignoring the safety of their allies. I should have executed you all, but for the sake of the merciful Father, I will give you another chance. I will establish a new combat unit, the Punishment Battalion. All cowards will be incorporated into the Punishment Battalion to carry out the most dangerous combat missions. The only way to leave the Punishment Battalion is to take the enemy's life, or to give your own. Everyone present held their breath, silently listening to Schroeder's instructions. Even the armies from other territories dared not utter a sound. They knew these words were not just directed at those who had heard. Now, a shadow larger than the orc army loomed over everyone's hearts. Your Excellency, Great Chieftain. Please drink. In a luxurious castle hall, Duke Dusan Bradley, head of the Bradley family, respectfully handed Ibarra a personally poured glass of wine. His hand holding the glass remained suspended in the air. Ibarra did not reach out to take it. An awkward embarrassment arose, and the Grand Duke's face showed obvious embarrassment. Only then did Ibarra reach out to take the document. My dear Duke, I was just a little distracted thinking about the next move. I hope you won't mind. The Grand Chieftain finished speaking and laughed heartily, and all the orc generals in the room joined in the laughter, creating a lively atmosphere. The Bradley family members, however, looked resentful. Of course, Grand Chieftain, you are always busy with important matters, and I truly admire your diligence in thinking, Grand Duke Bradley said with a smile, seemingly unconcerned about what had just happened. He had to be so humble. In the recent series of battles, he had personally witnessed the power of the orc army. He had thought he had gained a collaborator, but the orcs were now clearly taking the lead. This left the Grand Duke in a dilemma. Chapter 693 Dividing the Spoils. Your Excellency Chieftain Ibarra, Duke Bradley said respectfully, we have seen how invincible your army is. Those cowardly Rodney bastards are fleeing in terror. Ha ha ha, my dear friend, speak your mind. Ibarra's eyes gleamed with laughter, making Bradley feel somewhat uneasy. He paused before saying, the entire northeastern region of the kingdom is now under our control, Chieftain. Don't you think it's time to fulfill the latter part of our agreement? Ibarra feigned surprise, looking incredulous. Oh, right, we did have an agreement. His tone made Bradley's heart leap, wondering if this muscular barbarian would renege on his promise. In that case, let's proceed according to the latter part of the agreement. Ibarra's words brought a great sense of relief to Duke Bradley. Thank you, Chieftain Ibarra. I will deliver the gold coins and goods to your royal tent as promised. May the friendship between the Bradley family and the grasslands last forever. Someone. Bring the map. The supreme chieftain of the grassland orcs beckoned, and his servants immediately placed a large map on the table. Bradley had a bad feeling about what he was up to. Ibarra stroked his chin, tugging at his beard, a sly glint in his eyes. Dusan, as proof of our friendship, I have decided to gift you these towns. What? Dusan Bradley was bewildered. Here, and here, as a reward for fighting alongside us, I generously bestow them upon you. Ibarra pointed to the map, pointing out the locations one by one. My dear Dusan, your army is no longer needed for the battles to come. Leave it all to us. Lead your soldiers back home. Haven't you always longed to wear a crown? Go ahead and do it. It was as if a thunderbolt had struck from the sky. Dusan Bradley was stunned speechless for a long time. His long-held fears had come true. According to the initial agreement, the Bradley family hired orc armies to drive out the royal family's influence in the Yellow Earth, and in return, they would give the orcs a large amount of money and supplies every year. The Bradley family's ambition initially stopped at the Yellow Earth and the Neridan corridor, but when the orcs gained the upper hand on the battlefield and began to sweep across the entire northeastern territory of the kingdom like an autumn wind, the Duke was overjoyed, envisioning ruling the entire northeastern lands of the kingdom. Until he saw the orcs' extraordinary enthusiasm. If it were just about fulfilling their employer's task, they wouldn't need to fight so desperately. Your Excellency, I don't understand what you mean, Dusan Bradley continued, feigning ignorance. Your warriors have now fulfilled our agreement and can return to the plains with their spoils. The rest is up to us. Ibarra stared into his eyes, then suddenly burst into laughter, which was joined by the orc generals present. This time, their laughter was unabashedly sarcastic. Duke Bradley, Ibarra's tone hardened. Fulfilling the agreement means returning to the plains? Why? Don't forget, you only asked for the Yellow Earth Plains and Neridan. I am a man of my word, and I am now handing over the agreed-upon lands to you, but not the rest. Those were conquered by the warriors of the plains for themselves. Oh, my God. You don't think those extra conquered territories will be given to you as a freebie, do you? The chieftain's expression was exaggerated. No. You can't do this, Bradley panicked, and at the same time, he became furious. Orcs belong to the grasslands, they shouldn't covet the land south of the Rocky Mountains, the orc chieftain rudely retorted. Times have changed. Northern Alder is now like a juicy lamb, waiting for us to savor it. He showed no mercy to the Duke. Dusan Bradley felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, a bitter taste in his mouth. Using the orc army to achieve his goals was entirely different from handing over human lands to the orcs. The former would be seen by many as a mere expedient, the latter destined to make him infamous in human history. His face was almost purple with anger and fear. For some time, the Duke had been confident in his agreement with the orcs, envisioning the orc army entering Alder as a supporting force, or at most equal to the Bradley families, working together against the powerful royal army. But when the orc army actually poured into the northeast of the kingdom through the Rocky Mountains and the Nereidane corridor, he realized he had miscalculated. Abar had cunningly concealed the strength of the royal court in their previous dealings, causing the Duke to greatly underestimate his allies. However, once they revealed their true fangs, the Duke realized his own power had rapidly diminished to a negligible level, with the orcs waging the series of hard battles against the royal army. In that case, I believe this distribution is unfair, but realizing he could hardly avoid a huge infamy, Dusan Bradley immediately turned to securing more for himself. The distribution he referred to was the few towns Abar had just gifted him, which he considered insignificant. The Bradley family's army also participated in many battles. At least half of the Black Earth Plains would be a reasonable reward. Abar's eyes widened, seemingly shocked by the Duke's shamelessness. He decided to stop arguing, knowing that humans excelled at demanding exorbitant prices and then settling for meager ones. Roar, the great chieftain roared, behaving in a manner consistent with human stereotypes of orcs, kicking over the table. Dusan, do you think I can't see what your men are capable of? I only gave you a portion out of our past friendship. Since you're so greedy, I've changed my mind. Listen to me, now you only have barren lands. As for the rest, the Nereidane corridor, the Black Rock Plains, and all those I just mentioned, don't even think about them, no. The Nereidane corridor was our agreement. The Duke was startled by his sudden change of heart, falling into despair, but still trying to plead. Abel's face was contorted with rage as he pointed at him. You were greedy first. Now return to your own territory immediately. This is my last act of mercy. Dusan Bradley could only desperately suppress his anger, turning to lead his men out of the tent. Chapter 694 Understanding. How boring, are we just going to sit here forever? Private Jose West added firewood to the fire, his voice tinged with complaint. He took a full bowl of porridge and stirred it vigorously with a spoon. What, isn't it better to just wait it out? Why are you in such a hurry to fight the orcs? The sergeant beside him chuckled. Jose explained, I mean, the sooner we finish, the sooner we can go back. Sleeping in tents every day is nothing compared to the comfort of a proper barracks. The sergeant's face hardened, and he warned him, finish it sooner? How much do you underestimate the orcs? They're not like those laborers who just put down their hoes. You'll get hurt if you underestimate them. I reckon the higher-ups want to be fully prepared before attacking. Anyway, it's not as scary as the rumors say. Jose's eyebrows twitched. It's just a matter of one bullet. Recalling the battle a few days ago, the feeling of both fear and excitement was unforgettable. Especially when those tall, burly barbarians wielding swords charged towards him, their ferocious faces right in front of him. He saw he was so tense and scared that he felt an urge to urinate, yet strangely, this urge also revealed a strange, intoxicating pleasure. It was truly bizarre. Stand up. Salute, the squad leader suddenly shouted, standing up. Hisai quickly stood up, as did the others. Only then did they notice a tall, blonde woman walking towards them, followed by a group of people. They were all dressed in well-tailored, ornate clothing, their coats embroidered with intricate patterns, like the emblems of ancient noble families in the south. The clothing style of the Northwest Bay was quite different. For a long time, due to material scarcity, the people of the Northwest, from nobles to commoners, had relatively simple clothing, prioritizing convenience. This had become a tradition, maintained even after so many years of rapid development. Your Highness. Gentlemen, The squad leader solemnly led the way in saluting Catherine and her entourage. She was the royal princess? Lord Gleman's fiancée? Jose raised his hand and bowed respectfully to Catherine. Relax, soldiers, the princess smiled, her demeanor dignified yet approachable. Her long, wavy hair seemed to glow with a holy light in the sunlight, and her azure eyes were like sapphires. Ah, Lord Gleman will be very happy, Jose thought enviously. At that moment, he felt a chill and subconsciously shifted his gaze. He saw a black-haired female knight beside the princess staring at him with a cold gaze. This black-haired one is quite arrogant. Jose felt a little intimidated by her gaze, as if he were being reprimanded by a drill sergeant. He was talking about Athena. Since the betrayal of the Bradley family, the female knight had been scrutinizing everyone in this land far from crystal radiance. Are you eating? Yes, Your Highness. Catherine observed the small group's meals with interest. Each soldier had a side of cold vegetable salad, the aroma of which suggested the use of vinegar and sauce, quite appetizing. The main dishes were large pieces of flatbread or bread, along with generous portions of dried meat. A large bowl of thick porridge made from flour, vegetables, and minced meat ensured the soldiers wouldn't have to chew and swallow dryly. While not elaborate, it was certainly a generous offering. To everyone's surprise, some soldiers had a small bottle next to their utensils containing what appeared to be salt. Salt as white as snow. Catherine asked, "You eat this? It's the front lines. After all, we have to make do," the squad leader said, scratching his head somewhat sheepishly. The soldiers from Crystal Radiance were starting to tense up. Through their observations over the past few days, they had become able to discern rank by the striped insignia on the shoulders of the Alda army soldiers, their rank insignia. Clearly, these were just ordinary soldiers, at the very bottom of the pyramid-like organization of the military. For a mere group of common soldiers, this ration, with ample staple food, meat, vegetables, and even seasonings, was a meager compromise. Meanwhile, lords in other parts of the kingdom, even the royal army, the lowest-ranking soldiers were lucky to have a piece of black bread to eat and a sip of weak beer. Only after a victory could they improve their diet, either through rewards or plunder. Over the years, Klein and Athena had long since shed their old, stereotypical image of the Northwest Bay as a barren wasteland. They knew Arda was wealthy, but they hadn't realized it was this wealthy. Just as everyone's attention was focused on the soldiers' food, Catherine was drawn to something else. "What's this?" She bent down to pick up a book, or rather, a small booklet. "Ah, this is mine," Jose said hastily. "Your Highness, this is a natural history handbook," the squad leader explained. Actually, that's not quite accurate. To be specific, it only records many things about Black Rocklands, including local customs, geography, plants, etc., such as which plants are edible, which are poisonous, and various local slang, customs, and taboos. Catherine looked at Jose. "You can read," Jose nodded honestly. "Yes, Your Highness, so, you're usually responsible for teaching them this knowledge." Catherine felt a little sorry for the soldier in front of her. Paul had actually made someone like him a common soldier. "No," Jose shook his head. They read it themselves." Catherine and her men were surprised. "Your Highness, we each have one." The squad leader also took out his own booklet. "You can all read?" Klein couldn't help but ask. "Yes," the squad leader nodded. "It's a strict requirement in the army, everyone must be literate." Unbelievable. Catherine could only think this to herself. "May I take a look?" "Of course, Your Highness. Please take a look, there are no secrets in this." Catherine quickly finished reading the booklet and handed it back to Jose. She solemnly told the group, "Warriors, please make sure your booklets don't fall into the hands of the orcs, even if you have to destroy them." Although the contents didn't involve any military secrets, they could still provide considerable convenience to whoever possessed them. "Your Highness," at that moment, a servant rushed in, somewhat out of breath. "I finally found you." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Had something happened? Were the orcs about to attack? "What is it? Speak quickly." Her tone became stern. The servant hurriedly replied, "Count Griles has arrived. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels." Chapter 695 New Support. When Catherine entered the tent, Her fiancé was listening to Schroeder's latest report. Many unfamiliar faces surrounded Paul, all dressed in the uniforms of the Arda army, their shoulder insignia suggesting high-ranking officers. Hearing the commotion, Paul looked up, their eyes meeting. I should take the initiative, Paul thought, walking around the table to his fiancée and taking her hand. Catherine instinctively tried to pull her hand away, but stopped herself. It's so good to see you safe and sound, my dear. Never before addressed so publicly, Catherine's heart skipped a beat, a blush rising to her fair face. She gave Paul a slightly annoyed glare, reminding him to be mindful of the occasion, though she wouldn't object to him addressing her that way in private. Thank you for your support, Earl Gleman. Paul realized his overstepping, smiled sheepishly, and greeted Offina, Klein, and the others behind Catherine. The group sat down around the conference table. Paul began by introducing his entourage. Catherine, you already know many of the people who accompanied me to Crystal Radiance, but there are a few new faces I need to introduce you to. This is my artillery commander, Colonel Bryce Alder, a knight who has served the Gleman family for generations. Since I brought almost all of the cannons, he came along too. The burly Bryce immediately stood up and paid his respects to his future mistress. My logistics commander, Ron. Paul finished introducing everyone qualified to attend the meeting. Then, he spoke of the support he had brought. After Alder had conscripted a large number of men to expand the army, the remaining 4.5 battalions were quickly brought to full strength and were all taken to the front lines by Paul. At the same time, there was almost the entire army artillery force, 40 cannons of various sizes, mostly 4-pound or 6-pound cannons, plus the cannons that Schroeder had brought earlier, totaling 60 cannons. And the corresponding logistical support personnel, totaling more than 5,000 people. The bulk of the logistical burden was ammunition, gunpowder, shells, and bullets combined weighed over 20 tons, carried by more than 40 horse-drawn wagons. Even so, with a total number of Arda soldiers exceeding 4,000 in both waves, each soldier only received 50 rounds of ammunition, while each cannon could fire approximately 30 shells, the embarrassing fact being that the gunpowder currently being transported was insufficient to sustain the supply of shells and bullets, requiring further transport from the rear. The 4 newly arrived battalions were all composed of retired veterans, who, after some rehabilitation training, could be deployed to the front lines, while the vast militia took on the heavy responsibility of defending Arda's homeland. Meanwhile, Schroeder spoke to Paul about the enemy's strength. According to the latest intelligence, the Orcs have deployed between 15,000 and 20,000 cavalry in our direction, led by the Orc General Callum. The Orcs also have a large number of human soldiers, from various backgrounds, those appointed by rebellious lords, conscripted locals, or unscrupulous civilians who have defected. This group numbers approximately 20,000, mostly infantry. Paul frowned. Nearly 40,000 enemies. The situation is dire. Their own forces consist of about 10,000 troops from the Northwestern Bay Territories, 4,000 from Crystal Radiance, 10,000 from Black Rock Plains, and a small reinforcement force from the neighboring Mammoth Plains. They are fewer in number than the Orcs, and due to previous defeats, the morale of most of their troops is low, and they are filled with anxiety. He asked, "What kind of man is Callum?" Schroeder replied, "He's an ambitious Orc. At his current level, he's not yet part of the inner circle of the royal court, so Callum desperately wants to gain merit through the conquest of the northwest of the kingdom and win the favor of Warki Fabar." "Very well," Paul said firmly, "I don't want to become the fruit of someone else's tree of glory." He stood up and looked around at everyone. "The Orcs' outstretched claws will stop here and be severed." Apart from the generals from the Northwest Bay, many thought the young earl was boasting. Although his troops had achieved a small victory, it wasn't enough to change the course of the war. Earl Gleman, Duke Osman Alambro from Black Rock Plains, said with deep concern, "I hope you will treat these barbarians from the plains with caution. Although I had fully anticipated their ferocity before the Battle of Sunset Valley, I found that I had underestimated them once the battle actually began." Duke Alambro had been fortunate to survive Sunset Valley, but few of the 10,000 troops he had brought from his territory remained. In the Duke's view, Earl Gleman possessed the confidence appropriate for his age, but the confidence of youth often leads to disaster when faced with problems beyond their capabilities. Crucially, Paul Gleman was Princess Catherine's future husband. The defeat in Sunset Valley had already cast a shadow over the princess's reputation. Although the direct cause of the defeat was the reckless advance of the Central Army, Catherine, as the nominal commander-in-chief, would inevitably bear some of the negative impact. If your husband fails again, thank you for your reminder, Your Grace. I will gather everyone's wisdom to formulate a suitable battle strategy. After a thorough analysis of the enemy, Paul nodded with a smile. He could sense the old man's good intentions. At that moment, he felt a slightly hostile gaze from a young man beside Duke Alembru. Do you have any advice, Sir Montrich de Varus? Since they had already been introduced, Paul knew the young man's identity. No, Earl Giles. Osman suppressed his displeasure. He knew he bore a large part of the responsibility for the failure at Sunset Valley, so he needed to keep a low profile. Nevertheless, having a younger man speak so eloquently and maturely in front of him still stirred some unpleasantness within him. Moreover, this man was going to marry Princess Catherine. Before I left, Lacahert received a telegram from Crystal Radiance. I mean, a letter. Paul took out a piece of paper, showed it to Catherine first, and then passed it around to everyone. Prince Jassim has already set off north to negotiate with the orcs. The crowd discussed the contents of the telegram. What is the kingdom's government thinking? They should be sending more troops to give the orcs a good beating, not just spitting at them. Everyone was puzzled. Sending an envoy to negotiate after already suffering one defeat seemed almost like begging for mercy. Only Catherine and her group from Crystal Radiance felt bitter. The reason for the negotiations was that the kingdom's government didn't have many troops left, especially with a hostile Giles and Veblen still in the south. Chapter 696 Drill. Inside the tent, the crowd was indignant, but some remained silent, aware of the kingdom's current predicament. Paul slammed his fist on the table and shouted, as long as the king hasn't issued a formal ceasefire order, we will continue fighting. The tent quieted down slightly. Then I proposed that Sir Schroeder continue as the battlefield commander. Does anyone object? The crowd exchanged glances, but ultimately no one objected. The only victory the orcs had ever achieved in a direct confrontation was won by your troops. Whatever you say goes. Gentlemen, given the Northwest Army's novel tactics and weapons, I've decided to arrange a drill tomorrow for everyone to observe. To avoid friendly fire incidents during actual combat, everyone's interest was piqued. Many troops had retreated here after the Battle of Silver Moon Keep and hadn't witnessed firsthand how the Northwest Army defeated the orcs. They had only heard from those who had fought alongside the Arda army that the Northwest Army extensively used a type of tubular weapon, large and small, capable of spewing deadly flames to propel metal projectiles and kill enemies. It sounded like a crossbow or bow and arrow, but its range and power far exceeded that of ballistae and bows and arrows. Moreover, its firing was deafening, like thunder, and filled the battlefield with smoke. The next day arrived quickly. On the land in front of Silver Moon Fortress, cannons roared, smoke billowed, and 2 battalions of Arda troops, in neat formations, marched towards their designated targets, keeping time with the drumbeats. Under the command of flag signals, they practiced various tactical maneuvers, including lines, columns, hollow squares, volley fire, bayonet charges, and infantry-artillery coordination. The sheer power of the gunpowder weapons was astounding. The tactical prowess and excellent discipline displayed by the Arda soldiers were even more impressive to those in the know. It's easy for a stationary army to form a neat formation, but maintaining that formation while advancing is extremely difficult. Even more remarkable was their ability to rapidly change formations, as if each soldier knew their place from the start. Only rigorous training, day after day, year after year, could achieve such a level of proficiency. This is very useful. For ordinary armies, changing formations on the eve of battle carries enormous risks. It causes chaos, officers can't find their soldiers, and soldiers can't see their officers. If the battle drags on too long, friendly forces might think something is wrong, and the enemy often prefers to attack at such times. Therefore, many generals don't easily change their formations once they've set them up. Looking at the serious expressions on the observers' faces, Paul's lips curled slightly. The Arda army's battlefield mobility far exceeded the average level of that era, which was one of his proudest achievements. Long ago, when he learned about those famous battles with huge impact in history, he always felt puzzled. The direct tactical factors that determined the outcome of a battle often seemed very simple. In the Battle of Bibrac during the Gallic conquest, the Roman army deployed its usual 3-line formation against the Helvetii. However, after repelling the first wave of attacks, a large influx of Boy and Telingi reinforcements suddenly appeared on their flank. In this critical moment, Caesar decisively ordered all the companies in the third line to march laterally, effectively rotating the entire third line counterclockwise by 90 degrees to counter the new threat. In the Battle of Bredenfeld during the 30 Years' War, the Saxons, allies of the Swedish army, scattered. Gustavus Adolphus not only lost a third of his forces but also completely exposed his left flank. He immediately ordered his left-wing troops to rotate to right angle, forming a new defensive line to protect the center, and personally led 2 infantry regiments to reinforce the left flank. Caesar and Gustavus Adolphus are both renowned generals, and these 2 examples serve as testaments to their achievements. But Paul at the time was puzzled. That's it? Just redeploying a portion of the soldiers. When he played Total War games, a simple mouse click was all it took. It wasn't until he personally built and commanded his army in this life that he realized the true meaning of seemingly simple tactical maneuvers. Therefore, he placed extraordinary emphasis on discipline, training his soldiers with an intensity unimaginable to people of his time, 5 days of drills a week, and subtly influencing them in daily life through their attire and housekeeping. This finally yielded the results he had today. No flesh and blood in the world could withstand this power. A Lentrian knight, who had previously fought alongside the Arda army, stared fascinated at the firing cannons, explaining this terrifying weapon to his companions. When facing its projectiles, no matter how thick your armor, it's no different than being covered in butter. I personally witnessed a column of orc soldiers being wiped out by a single shot. In fact, he didn't need to emphasize it much. The trenches carved into the ground by the cannon fire and the splashing dirt already made everyone frown. No wonder the previously unknown Gleman family has risen to prominence in recent years, even forging a marriage alliance with a royal family. Many people thought they had found the answer. The drill lasted all morning, and by noon, the onlookers dispersed, each with their own thoughts. The performance of the Arda army had left a deep impression on them. "Why won't you let me see Princess Catherine?" Paul was questioned by his mother as soon as he returned to his residence. Near the time of departure, Marianne had sent her second son, Nathan, away, but she herself had accompanied the army, citing confirming that the child was capable of protecting himself. In fact, she was indeed worried and had always opposed Paul interfering in matters outside her territory. "How am I supposed to explain your existence to her?" Paul shrugged, quite helplessly. All right, Marianne didn't dwell on the topic. After all, it was just a question. Apart from her son's inner circle, she didn't want her identity to be exposed too early. Catherine was currently only Paul's fiancée, and the two had only known each other for a short time. "I remember you said you didn't bring much gunpowder. Why waste it here?" Mariana had encountered many new things these past few days and was amazed by her son's ability to invent so many strange and unusual things, but they were often very useful. To intimidate, of course. Paul waved his hand. "We're about to fight the orcs, and I don't want to be surrounded by two-faced cowards. Besides, it's also to give them some confidence." Mariana nodded. She herself had previously thought that her son's army was no different from the armies of other lords, but the march and today's drills had changed her mind. In the martial Gabella Empire, she had thought she had witnessed the strongest army among the human nations, but now it seemed that the Arda army surpassed them in terms of sheer force. Chapter 697 Negotiation. Inside the enormous tent, Abar, the chieftain and leader of the grassland orcs, welcomed his guests. The radiant nobles, dressed in magnificent attire, Prince Jassim and his retinue, entered the tent one by one, their faces solemn. "Please sit, Your Highness, and all other distinguished guests," Abar said, sitting cross-legged in the main seat to the north, gesturing to a row of tables to his left. To his right sat the trusted members of the royal court, their eyes fixed intently on the human guests. Prince Jassim nodded and, along with his entourage, took their seats as arranged by Abar, sitting cross-legged like the orcs. This arrangement made him very uncomfortable, and his already somewhat uneasy mood worsened. Both sides introduced their members. Just as Jassim thought they were about to get down to business, the orc chieftain waved his hand. "No rush into negotiations. Our guests have traveled such a long way, they must be exhausted. Let's treat them well. Serve the food." At Abar's command, waiters carried in huge platters laden with whole, roasted, golden brown mutton and pork, which were placed before the guests. Prince Jassim frowned. This kind of food was too tough for the Crystal Radiance people, especially since his own stomach was no longer young. "Let's eat our fill before we talk. Please." Abar gestured and began to eat heartily. As soon as the food was placed down, The orc generals started tearing off large chunks of meat, or cutting them off with knives, chewing and swallowing them, then gulping down wine to moisten their mouths. This straightforward eating style left the crystal-radiant nobles exchanging bewildered glances. According to their custom, even when eating such a large, meaty dish, it was cut into small pieces, accompanied by various appetizers, and eaten slowly with a fork. What an uncivilized bunch of barbarians, many thought to themselves, but the thought that the kingdom's army had been defeated by these savages only added to their dejection. Seeing the humans frozen in place, Abar smiled and said, "Guests, are you dissatisfied with our hospitality?" Of course not. Fortunately, the orcs had taken care of them somewhat. The table was set with human utensils like knives and forks, preventing the delegation members from eating barehanded. "Then, we should end this conflict, Your Highness." As the feast progressed into its latter half, Abar brought up the main purpose of the meeting. Prince Jassim said solemnly, "Your war against Alder is completely unjustified and you should immediately withdraw from Alder's territory." Bang! "This is revenge and punishment for humanity," a younger orc roared, slamming his fist on the table before him, almost knocking the food off. His face resembled Abar's. Jassim, recalling the earlier introduction, recognized him as Abar's eldest son, Agile. Perhaps due to the alcohol, the young orc prince was agitated, even the fur on his cheeks couldn't hide his flushed skin. "Insolent wretch!" Jassim's guard knights rose to their feet, glaring angrily. "Arrogant human!" With a clatter, almost the entire orc rank stood up, glaring back at the knight. Bang! Abar slammed his hand on the table, his face displeased. "Sit down. We are negotiating." He glared at his eldest son. "Get out. You've made a fool of yourself after a few drinks, father." Immediately, Agile left dejectedly. The remaining orcs sat down reluctantly. Abar looked at Jassim, somewhat surprised. The human king's father remained remarkably composed. His son's sudden outburst hadn't even caused the old man to flinch. He remained completely unfazed. I wonder if he can maintain such composure until the very end." "Your Highness, please forgive my son's rudeness," Abar apologized, his tone even somewhat sincere, but then his tone shifted. "However, I must say, he has a point. Our entry into human land this time is entirely based on justice and righteousness. It's a reciprocal measure against humanity's millennia-long harassment of the grasslands." This made Jassim want to spit on Abar. The conflict between humans and grassland orcs, though both sides felt wronged, was a messy, unresolved issue where no one could claim innocence. Whether Agile's actions were intentional or not, he considered it a preemptive strike by the orcs, a clear indication that they were determined to take a bite out of him. "My view is exactly the opposite of yours," the prince intended to argue his point. "The Watchers haven't been active on the plains for a long time, while the orcs raid southwards through the Loki Mountains every year. No. That's not raiding, that's retaliation, but it's still insignificant, completely incomparable to the damage you've inflicted on the plains throughout history," Abar retorted without backing down. The two argued fiercely for a while. Finally, Jassim sighed. "So, great chieftain, what price do you intend to offer, and what will it take to make you withdraw from human lands?" Seeing his opponent soften, Abar was overjoyed. The Neredan Corridor, the Yellow Earth, the Black Rock Plains, and the Mammoth Fields, he listed his conditions one by one. What did this mean? The delegation members exchanged bewildered glances. This is utterly ridiculous." Prince Jassim's beard trembled. He understood Abar's meaning. The orcs wanted land. By the Lord of Light, these 4 places practically represented the entire northwestern region of the Alder Kingdom. The others also realized, exclaiming in disbelief. Before the formal meeting, the delegation had discussed their bottom line. They could offer the orcs a large sum of money or much-needed houses in exchange for their withdrawal from the kingdom. However, they hadn't expected the orcs to want far more than they could accept. The prince said seriously, "Countless humans live on this land, it's impossible to cede it to you." Abar replied, "Oh, we will govern them reasonably. I think the people here will be happy to accept more enlightened rulers." Enlightened? The grassland model cannot be applied to humans. "We are happy to learn your ways. Since entering Alder, countless people have come to join us. Would you like to inspect my human army? They are extremely loyal and brave. The war is going so smoothly thanks to them." Abar laughed heartily as he spoke. The members of the Alder delegation were all furious, their faces turning red. Chapter 698 Blackmail. The stalemate in the negotiations lasted for several days. The Orcish chieftain was a resolute man, determined to annex the entire northeastern region of the Alder Kingdom. Prince Jasim, head of the Alder delegation, was equally adamant, insisting that the orcs immediately withdraw from human lands. Then one day, Chieftain Abar invited Prince Jasim to go fishing by the river. According to the chieftain, this was a purely private activity, a way to relax before the tense negotiations, and would not involve the forces represented by either side. Both men met only with their guards, completely omitting their respective high-ranking officials. Prince Jasim accepted Abar's invitation, going only with his personal guards. He, of course, didn't believe Abar's nonsense about it being just a private activity. Abar wanted to meet with him alone because there must be something he couldn't discuss openly. Perhaps a rebellion had broken out on the plains, or perhaps Gabella or some other force had offended the orcs. Abar must have some pressing issues to address immediately, and he hoped both sides would make some concessions so that the other could step down gracefully. Prince Jasim held a rather optimistic attitude towards this private meeting. In a dense forest, birds sang and flowers bloomed everywhere. Several babbling brooks flowed into a small lake. The water was crystal clear, revealing fish frolicking within, each one plump and tempting to cast a line. It was indeed a perfect place for relaxation and fishing, and Prince Jasim found it strange that the burly orc chieftain possessed such refined tastes. The prince rode his horse across the soft grass to the lakeside, where Abar had already cast his line. He sat in a reclining chair, a small round table beside him set with wine vessels, looking completely at ease. The prince was somewhat puzzled. The orc chieftain showed no sign of urgency. He rose from his chair and welcomed him, saying, "Your Highness, it is a pleasure to enjoy this beautiful scenery with me." Jasim felt a surge of displeasure. Clearly an invader, yet he acted as if he owned this land. He smiled slightly. "It's wonderful to find such relaxation amidst the tension." The prince took the fishing rod from Abar, glanced at the lake, and skillfully cast a line. The two sat together by the lake, sipping wine and chatting. After sharing anecdotes about the grasslands and Jingai-Ao, Jasim finally heard what Abar truly wanted to say. "Your Highness, you should agree to my conditions, it's for your own good." Jasim chuckled. "I'm sorry, but I find it hard to agree. If I did, I'd become the target of everyone's criticism." Abar sighed. "All right, actually, I've invited another guest here." Jasim looked at Abar with suspicion as he waved towards the distance. Soon, a figure emerged from the shadows of the forest and slowly walked towards them. "This is..." His face first showed confusion, then slowly turned to shock. "Merciful Father," the prince prayed silently. Seeing the change in his expression, Abar smiled. "I think this is also an old acquaintance of yours." The newcomer was a man dressed in black robes, who appeared to be a Gabaran. "Your Highness, it's been a long time," the man greeted him calmly. "Who are you?" "I don't know you," Jasim replied, his tone still composed. "How, it's not good to be so disrespectful to an old friend," Abar said with amusement, his tone sharp but like knives stabbing Jasim's heart. The man waved his hand dismissively. "You don't want to see me? That's not important. I'll be leaving soon and won't spoil your good mood. But before I go, I need to convey a small suggestion from the Mystic Society." The Mystic Society, that word finally made Jasim lose his temper. His face flushed, and he roared in a low, shrill voice, "What are you doing here? I don't need your so-called assistance anymore." The guards in the distance noticed the prince's unusual behavior and walked over. Jasim immediately gestured to them, stopping the guards from approaching. "Don't worry, I'm not here to assist you, but to collect a small reward," the man said with a smile. "You, and you," Jasim pointed angrily at him and Abar, who stood by silently smiling. "You two have actually colluded." He never imagined that Abar's so-called fishing was actually targeting him. "Please don't use such harsh words," Abar said gently. "Anyone can make a deal with anyone, haven't you done that before?" The man in black robe said. "Your Highness, to avoid wasting each other's time, I'll be direct. The Mystic Society hopes you can fulfill certain requests of the High Chieftain." "That's impossible." Jasim was furious. The man in black robes frowned, his previously cheerful face now covered with frost. "Then we'll have to reveal some secrets that only we know. For example, the health of the former king of Alder." Jasim narrowed his eyes. "You have no evidence, believe me." "Your Highness, if I didn't have evidence, I wouldn't be here to offer you this advice with such confidence." This was a harsh warning, and Prince Jasim felt as if he had instantly plunged into an ice cave. For the crown he had once so desperately desired, he had once cooperated with the Arcane Society. Just at one time. Just at one time. Jasim roared inwardly. Just the one damn time. What evidence did they leave behind? His brain raced. Dealing with such an unpopular group as wizards, he was extremely careful with every contact, even writing letters himself. How could he possibly leave behind any damned evidence? But he dared not gamble. If they actually produced something, he would be utterly ruined. Seeing his hesitation, the man slowly unfolded a piece of parchment. Jasim was instantly struck dumb. Indeed, it was a letter he had written himself, containing details of a deal with the Arcane Society. But this letter was clearly addressed to another confidant. How did it end up in the Arcane Society's hands? You have no doubt, Your Highness. The letter's holder is utterly loyal to you. He is, and he may be in the future, the black-robed man said slowly. But he couldn't withstand the power of arcane magic. In his memory, he even believed the letter had been destroyed. Jasim sank into despair. Indeed, these cursed fellows possessed strange and bizarre abilities. Very well, the prince exhaled heavily, trying to calm himself. We can compromise, but we still need to discuss the details. It's settled. Abel and the black-robed man exchanged a glance. The cooperation was satisfactory. They spoke to each other with their eyes. Chapter 699 On the Eve of Battle. While the kingdom's delegation and the orcs were locked in difficult negotiations, a battle that would determine the fate of the kingdom's northwest was about to begin. After a month's stay at Silver Moon Fortress, Paul's long-awaited supplies were finally gathered, and the arrival of ammunition filled him with confidence. With a fully equipped Alder army at its core, the Alder army finally began its eastward march, aiming to reclaim lost territory. Finally, in a place called the Ursula Plains, a little-known plain in the vast northwest of the kingdom, the eastward marching Alder army unexpectedly encountered the main force of the orcs' westward expedition, which was gathering to the west. Upon discovering that the opposing main force was close at hand, the two armies tacitly stopped and set up camp, conserving their strength for the upcoming decisive battle. Along the way, the Alder army had experienced the tactics of the orc cavalry countless times. The enemy operated in small squads, capable of suddenly appearing from the left, right, or even rear at any moment, displaying their fierce and deadly nature. For the newly arrived Alder army, such frequent and intense harassment was unprecedented in the previous combat experience. Initially, this placed immense psychological pressure on some inexperienced soldiers. However, Alder's muskets and cannons ultimately surpassed the orcs' bows and crossbows in range and accuracy. Coupled with strict discipline, no one was allowed to leave the ranks to pursue without permission. They eventually overcame the effects of this tactic. The Alder army chose open terrain as their marching route to maximize the use of their telescopes. Orc cavalry attacks were often detected early, allowing for defensive preparations as they approached. For the Alder army, switching from marching to defensive formations was easy, and the early warning gave other units more time. When orc cavalry arrived, they were often met with a devastating barrage of muskets, cannons, and powerful crossbows. As the Alder army gradually adapted, the orcs' harassment tactics became increasingly ineffective, leaving large numbers of corpses with only sporadic casualties for the Alder. Alder's logistics force, tasked with supplying the main army, was also heavily armed, making them difficult to approach. Furthermore, the Alder army repaid their previous IOUs with money, establishing a good reputation in the region and making it easier to obtain various necessities. The orc army's steadfastness at the front greatly encouraged the people in the rear, leading to the spontaneous formation of militias to defend their homes, which severely hampered the orc cavalry infiltrating behind orc lines. Callum, the commander of the orc westward advance, was deeply dissatisfied with the current situation. The orc army gathered at Silver Moon Hold seemed less easily defeated than previous enemies. After learning that Princess Catherine was at Silver Moon Hold, Callum concluded that humanity had clearly recovered from the panic caused by their previous defeat. He then summoned his scattered troops and decided to replicate the decisive Battle of Sunset Valley, shattering the orcs' newly restored confidence once again. After their success, the Orcish army could launch another offensive. Callum optimistically believed he could ride his horse until he saw the sea. He was confident he could defeat the humans once, and defeat them a second time. Thus, the two sides met in the plains of Ursula. The Orcish army made no special moves, continuing their usual eating and sleeping habits, except that the security in their camp was several levels higher than usual. Scouts frequently went in and out, constantly reporting back on the surrounding situation. The ordinary soldiers' camp was very quiet, but a restless tension lurked beneath the silence. Everyone knew the big battle was coming. The Orcish side, on the other hand, was in an uproar, incredibly noisy. Callum ordered a feast for the entire army, and the entire camp was filled with the aroma of roasted meat and wine. The Orcish soldiers ate and drank heartily, singing and dancing. This was a tradition in the Orc army. Generous rewards boosted the morale of the warriors. Unlike humans, orcs possessed a special physique that allowed them to quickly and efficiently convert large amounts of food into stored energy, ensuring sufficient stamina for subsequent battles. Of course, their camps remained on high alert. Until sunset, both camps fell silent, awaiting the arrival of the next day. At dawn on August 26, 1995, Sacred Calendar, the bugle calls of the Arda army and the horns of the orcs almost simultaneously broke the morning silence. As the armies assembled and advanced, the human and orc armies finally faced each other about a mile apart. Because no charge had yet been launched, both sides maintained relatively orderly formations. The morning wind caused the banners to flutter, filling the flat plain with a somber atmosphere. The orc army's deployment was quite simple. The infantry lined up in a single file around the Arda army, with cavalry from the Royal Knights and other territories providing flank cover. The Arda army employed linear tactics, with 6 battalions arranged in 3 shallow, deep lines, 2 battalions in reserve at the rear, and over 40 artillery pieces deployed partly in front of the lines and partly in the gaps between them. Paul, mounted on horseback, observed the orc army opposite him through binoculars. The enemy's main force was cavalry in the center, with light cavalry in front and heavy cavalry behind, flanked by human infantry as vassal troops. A truly fierce battle is about to begin, Paul thought nervously. All his years of hard work were finally going to be put to the test. He glanced around. The commanders of the various Orda army units surrounded him, and nodded to Schroeder. Schroeder pulled a pocket watch from his robes. "Gentlemen, now check the time." Hearing this, everyone else also pulled out pocket watches. These were all issued to the Arda army. Unlike the bulky clocks of the past, these pocket watches from the Northwest Bay were exquisitely crafted and compact, very convenient to carry, and everyone liked them. 7:24 a.m., Schroeder read aloud, and everyone checked that their pocket watches matched the time. Once the time was calibrated, Schroeder immediately ordered, "To your positions." The commanders saluted Paul and Schroeder, then rode off to command their respective troops. "I'm going to. Good luck," Catherine said, looking over. "Good luck to you too," Paul nodded to her. He actually hoped Catherine would stay with him, but the princess insisted on remaining with her men. Chapter 700 Ordos. Huh. Are those the so-called Northwesterners? Or rather, the Alder? Indeed, a truly different human army. Callum, the Orc commander of the westward expedition, placed a hand on his forehead, his attention completely drawn to the rows of neatly aligned soldiers in the center of the Alder army. Look at them, standing so straight, their bearing is like that of ceremonial guards in a human court. The Orc general licked his lips and then let out a sneer. I wonder if their fighting prowess will be as impressive as their bearing. His men behind him also burst into laughter, most of them believing it would be an ordinary battle. The steppe army would crush the enemy before them and bring the entire northwestern lands of Alder under their control. Callum continued to stand with his back to his men, a hint of seriousness flashing in his eyes out of their sight. As a seasoned and experienced general, he intuitively sensed the extraordinary nature of the army before him. Unlike the haphazardly dressed allies on the flanks, the Gulfmen's uniforms were simple and uniform. While an individual might not seem remarkable, when these soldiers stood in neat rows, and several rows in a square formation, a silent but overwhelming aura of power emanated from them. Callum had never underestimated this suddenly appearing human reinforcement. He had listened carefully to Amar's description of the Battle of Silver Moon Keep, knowing that the Ardra possessed formidable weapons, strict discipline, and powerful fighting strength. His earlier feindes was merely a morale-boosting tactic, but Callum also trusted his warriors. They would despise the enemy, but they wouldn't let that defiance affect their performance. The Orc commander raised his arm high, then swung it down like a guillotine. "Kill them," a loud horn boomed, echoing across the wilderness. The already excited warhorses finally heard the long-awaited signal. Their spirited masters gave them a tug on the reins, and they immediately galloped towards the enemy. Under the riders' skillful control, they didn't run wildly, but rather trotted slowly, conserving their energy for the final charge. Whoosh! Whoosh! A cacophony of hooves pounded the earth, the dense sound like countless hands slapping water. The orcs launched their first attack, a full 10,000 cavalry charging towards the central infantry phalanx of the orc army, while another 5,000 cavalry were deployed on the left and right flanks to coordinate the attack and contain the orc cavalry also positioned on the flanks. From the Austrian army's perspective, the opposing cavalry began to move to the sound of horns. At first, it didn't seem like much, but gradually dust began to rise in the distance. As the distance closed, the enemy's image became clearer. Countless horses formed a dark mass, the dust they kicked up billowing into the sky like a sandstorm, with countless enemies hidden within the clouds. From top to bottom, most of the Arda army was facing such a scene for the first time. Although they regularly received training and courage against cavalry, they had never encountered such a massive force. Unease began to creep among the soldiers and spread rapidly. Officers at all levels did their best to encourage their men, even though they themselves were uneasy. On a slightly higher spot, Paul swallowed hard. His heart clenched with fear, his body stiffened, and he could barely breathe. Perhaps he shouldn't have come here. This fearful thought even flashed through his mind. I might end up here. Just then, his left and right shoulders were gently pressed almost simultaneously, two different sensations flowing through him, one a gentle warmth, the other a soothing coolness. The fear in his heart instantly dissipated, miraculously. He looked to his left in surprise. His mother, Mariana, was staring at him, her eyes full of confidence. I can at least guarantee my child will be all right. Thank you. Paul then looked to his right, the green-haired witch met his gaze and nodded encouragingly. Perhaps they had done something to him. Was it magic? In any case, a feeling gradually rose within Paul, confidence. Scrod, Paul called out to his battlefield commander. Lord Gleman, what are your orders? Scrod, who was intently calculating the orcs' charge distance, looked at him. I want to address the entire army. In the orderly ranks, Private Jose West felt his bladder was about to burst. The unprecedentedly large-scale cavalry offensive made him desperate to urinate. Damn it, I shouldn't have drunk so much water before we assembled. Guys, watch out. Our artillery will be firing soon. Blast these guys to smithereens. The instructor's trembling shout had little effect. Many men's hands, gripping their guns, trembled slightly. SHH. Don't make a sound, the company commander suddenly warned from a distance. We've got a signal, brothers. An order from Earl Griles. No, a message. A loud voice suddenly rang out. The communications soldier, who had just put down his binoculars, shouted excitedly. Everyone pricked up their ears to listen. Alder expects everyone to fulfill their duties, he shouted with all his might. In that instant, a certain emotion welled up in everyone's chest, almost squeezing out fear. Through the signal, Paul's words were quickly conveyed to all the human officers and soldiers, not just the Alda army. Images flashed through the minds of almost everyone. Wisps of smoke rising from chimneys, plump ears of wheat, bustling markets, playful children, loving parents, beloved girls, the list goes on, but these are all ordinary scenes. Now, these commonplace things have become so precious, and a heavy sense of responsibility suddenly weighs on everyone's shoulders. No retreat. Crush these long-haired bastards and make them regret ever setting foot on Alder's land. Yes, not just the Northwest Bay, not just the Black Rocklands, not just the Yellow Plains and the Elephant Plains, but the entirety of Alder. These soldiers from different places, most of them leaving their homes for the first time, would have toiled silently in the fields if it weren't for the orc invasion. The farthest they'd ever been was their lord's town, and they'd only hear bards singing distant tales in the markets. Alder was a concept so thin it was almost imperceptible to them. Nation and owner were things only nobles and knights could talk about. They were content to tend their own small plots of land. But now, facing a common enemy, an enemy so different from themselves, a seed was planted in everyone's heart. Aldo expects everyone to fulfill their duties. Paul's words allowed that seed to take root and sprout. We are us, they are them. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.